From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. October 4, 1999 Observer Newsletter. WWF Unforgiven and UFC 22 Reviews. By Dave Meltzer. The workload stemming from increasing the television demands of the WWF started to show through on September 26 with a disappointing Unforgiven pay-per-view show. The show featured some sluggish performances inside the ring, mental errors outside, and weak crowd heat except for the main event before a crowd of 15,779, a few thousand shy of capacity, paying $505,477 and another $93,006 in merchandise at the Charlotte Coliseum. Hunter Hearst Helmsley left the ring as WWF champion for a second time after a six-pack match which also included Kane, Mankind, Rock, Big Show, and Davey Boy Smith, and had Steve Austin at ringside as an enforcer. Austin, who did color commentary most of the match, got physical in the finish, beating up some referees, counting the pinfall of Helmsley over Rock, largely due to a chair shot by Smith, and then made the attempt to send the crowd home happy by giving Triple H a stunner. Triple H has been heavily criticized as WWF champion in the few weeks he held the title as something of a DDP-level champion, a good performer and hard worker but one being pushed due to outside circumstances, political favors in one case, what is deemed the right look in the other, to a level above what he deserves. While the WWF product itself has remained red-hot, Helmsley, a strong interview and a good performer in the ring, has not garnered the heat one would think despite the company focusing on him as the main character on television for the past 2 months with Austin being injured. The company tried to create the scenario where Triple H wasn't the company's hand-picked champion and that he wasn't simply given the title, as evidenced by him having to wrestle 5 times on SmackDown against top-level stars in their specialty matches and win 3 of them just to be one of 6 in the finals, and then winning that match. But Triple H winning is the result that made the most logical sense, as Austin challenging for the title is still the biggest box office match, and adding to the story is Triple H was the one who injured Austin at SummerSlam, although then rushing Austin back to television for ratings purposes weakened that aspect of the story. The main event had enough booking swerves and good enough work by most of the participants, including Davey Boy Smith's best in-ring work in years. Not that it was that good, but it was better than most expected and was worlds better than his WCW work, to be a good but hardly memorable main event. The rest of the show ranged from a few decent matches, to mostly disappointing matches and one of the worst pay-per-view matches in history. The show opened with the referees still on strike. The Scab Ref storyline played a part in several of the finishes. 1. Val Venus, Sean Morley, pinned Steve Blackman in 6:33 with the money shot. Steve Lombardi was the ref. Jerry Lawler noted that Lombardi was not only the Brooklyn Brawler, but at one time was Doink the Clown. He should have mentioned Kim Chi and the other half-dozen characters as well. Venus said he was similar to Hurricane Floyd since he was blown from one end of the state to the other. Blackman flexed his bicep, making it the first act of showmanship of his natural life. After losing, Blackman laid out Venus with a kendo stick to the shoulder, making it the first time anyone in sports has ever been knocked unconscious with a blow to the shoulders. They brought in EMTs to revive Venus, including one 1980s Missy Hyatt-looking woman who was clearly a plant. Director of Security Jim Dotson speared Blackman. I've been waiting for him to do something like that in an angle. Decent work overall. 1.5 stars. 2. D'Lo Brown, Oxy Connor, pinned Mark Henry to win the European title in 9/11. Tom Pritchard was the ref. Henry came out with 2 women and claimed there would be no match because he had suffered a brainerism, a term Jerry Lawler used the rest of the night. Brown worked hard but Henry was really bad here, missing a lot of spots, and the match had no heat. Brown won with a power bomb followed by a frog splash. 1/2 star. 3. Jeff Jarrett beat China Joni Lauer by a DQ in 11:52 to retain the IC title. Harvey Whippleman, Bruno Lauer, no relation to China, was the referee. Jarrett dumped Deborah and told her not to come out, which basically teased the finish. Jarrett came off the top into a low blow. Jarrett then crotched China on the post. China sold a dropkick from Jarrett that missed. They showed Fabulous Moolah and Johnny May Young at ringside. Angle alert. Chyna had Jarrett on her shoulders and delivered a fallback slam. Chyna used a power slam for a near fall. Jarrett did a very good job here carrying it to a decent match because as a worker Chyna is still pretty green. Chyna used a power bomb for a near fall, then tried a Hurricane Rana but Jarrett blocked it for a near fall. Jarrett went for the figure 4 but Chyna kicked Jarrett over the top rope. Jarrett's overselling there looked silly. Chyna hit Jarrett with a chair and bulldogged him on the Spanish announcer's table, but it didn't break. Chyna tried a pedigree, but Jarrett blocked it and catapulted her into the ref. Miss Kitty went to give Jarrett the guitar, but Moolah and Young hopped the rail and hit the ring and began pounding on Jarrett. This was still pretty campy so it was entertaining, although the joke got old by the end of the night. Moolah and Young double suplexed Jarrett, but he came back to double clothesline them. Young rolled off the apron onto the floor. Deborah showed up and shoved Miss Kitty down. Jarrett went for the figure 4 on Chyna, but Deborah clocked him with the guitar and Chyna pinned him. After the match Pritchard came out and told Whippleman about the finish and they showed it on the video wall so Whippleman reversed the decision. Geez, if they just showed replays on the video wall, every single WWF and WCW finish will be reversed. Chyna beat up Pritchard after the match, including delivering a low blow and a pedigree. Moolah and Young were helped backstage after the match. Reasonably entertaining. 2.25 stars. 4. Farouk, Ron Simmons, Ann Bradshaw, John Layfield beat the Dudleys, Mark LaMonica and Devin Hughes, in 7:28. They are making far too many ECW references in commentary for there not to be far more of a relationship between the two companies than anyone is letting on. Regular ref Jimmy Corderis, who crossed picket lines, did this match. Bubba looked really bad doing high spots. No heat at all. Bradshaw did a really hot backwards superplex standing on the top rope on Devon for a near fall, which got no heat. The Dudleys did the 3D on Farouk. Stevie Richards came out dressed as an acolyte with UPN tattooed on his chest. Now that was funny, and superkicked Devon allowing Farouk to pin him. After the match, the acolytes destroyed Richards with Farouk doing a Dominator on his head and then Bradshaw, with Farouk's help, doing a double-team power bomb. After laying him out, both men then shook Richards' hand, apparently thanking him for his help. 1/2 star. 5. Ivory Lisa Moretti retained the WWF Women's title pinning Luna, Gertrude Vachon Heath, in 3:37 after hitting her with a pole. This was far less risque than the Ivory vs. Tori match on Raw. Mainly the women were throwing things against the wall so they'd break. Luna tried to make copies of Ivory's face in a copy machine. Luna threw a phone at the wall and a TV set at the wall. Luna dove off a forklift onto Ivory, who was laying on cardboard boxes that appeared to have foam underneath, which looked about as dangerous as falling into a gymnastics pit. Tori came out for absolutely no reason except to show she had a new boob job at the finish. Ivory pinned Luna after hitting her with a pole. After the match during an interview, Moolah and Mae Young attacked Ivory. The joke had long since gotten old by that point. 1/4 star. 6. New Age Outlaws, Brian James and Monty Sopp retained the WWF tag titles beating Edge, Adam Copeland, and Christian J. Resso in 11:09. Lawler, during this match, noted that this broadcast was being aired live all over North America and Canada as well. Match was fine but not on the level of most of Edge and Christian's matches of late. Christian delivered the reverse DDT on Dog, but then Gangrel and the Hardy Boys came out. Gangrel and Matt attacked Christian and dragged him outside the ring. Jeff then delivered a missile dropkick to Edge, allowing Gunn to pin him after a famouser. 2.25 stars. 7. Al Snow, Alan Sarvin beat Big Boss Man, Ray Traylor, in a hardcore match with a regular cage encased with a Hell in a Cell match with vicious dogs between the two cages in 11:42. They spent a long time setting up the inside cage leading to rare WWF dead time on a pay-per-view. Usually in this situation they play video features and I can't figure out why they didn't here. Bossman's right, I still looked bad from the angle on Monday when Snow hit him with a glass pitcher, and they said he had structural damage to the eye. This was among the all-time worst matches ever. The thing was built around the dogs, and you may be able to teach dogs to perform high spots, but you can't guarantee the timing will be right on television. The dogs showed up, with one of them peeing on the floor. Rather than roaming, they were on short leashes and paid no attention to Bossman and instead barked at each other. Jim Ross called it a bowling shoe of a match, you know, really ugly, quickly, and by the time it was over, Ross noted it was the first time, and quite possibly the last time such a match had ever taken place in the WWF. Fans were chanting boring, and because the dogs screwed up the match, it didn't matter what the two did, which included Bossman taking a superplex off the cage. Snow bled after Bossman hit him twice with a cookie sheet. They used pliers to the ear of Snow, but nobody cared. Snow hit Bossman with a stick and he bled. They set up another spot for the dogs, but they paid no attention and kept barking at each other. Bossman handcuffed Snow to the turnbuckles and went to climb out. Snow broke the handcuffs way too easily and the crowd groaned. Snow finally pulled out the re-emergence of head, which drew a few cheers and mainly more groans, and hit Bossman with it. Both started climbing with no drama because nobody cared and Snow got out to win. Bossman was then supposed to run for his life from the dogs, who again paid no attention to him despite their trainers trying to get them to chase. -3 stars. 8. X-Pac, Sean Waltman, beat Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine in 13-10. Jericho came out and said sarcastically that he was out to save the pay-per-view. Unfortunately, this was too close to the truth. This match was a huge disappointment. There was some problems working together, but most of the problems were due to the crowd turning its back on the ring to watch a fight. There were cheers and boos and chants, none of which had anything to do with the match. It was made even more pathetic on television, with Ross desperately trying to convince the audience that somehow these pops for no reason had something to do with people rooting X-Pac on. X-Pac did a Silver King Tope Con Hilo. Curtis Hughes clotheslined X-Pac right in front of Ref Pritchard. Jericho did his dropkick off the rope spot with X-Pac on the apron taking a good bump to the floor. They did some near falls toward the end, but the match was pretty much a lost cause, with X-Pac doing a superplex off the top and Jericho doing a double power bomb. X-Pac used a Bronco Buster with Jericho hanging in the corner upside down. The finish was real flat with Hughes punching Pritchard for the DQ. Hughes and Jericho doubled on X-Pac until Road Dogg made the save. I can't believe Jericho didn't win or even wasn't allowed to look strong at the finish in his pay-per-view debut match. 1.5 stars. 9. Helmsley, Paul Levesque, won the six-pack match over Kane, Glenn Jacobs, Mankind, Michael Foley, Rock, Dwayne Johnson, Big Show, Paul White, and Davey Boy Smith in 2028. Austin came out to do commentary and Corderis was ref. It was a good main event. Some brawling in the aisle. Mankind hit Triple H with the steps, pile drove him on the steps and gave him a wedgie. All the refs showed up and you could see where that was going. A lot of saves. The rules of this match make no logical sense because at least an elimination match makes sense, but logic would dictate nobody would ever tag if it's the first man to score a pin to win. Anyway, guys were saving the near falls left and right because that meant somebody else would win the title. Rock stole a beer from Austin and threw it on Triple H. Kane used the tombstone on Mankind but Show threw Kane out of the ring. Show set up a clothesline on Mankind but Kane clotheslined him. Bulldog power slammed Kane. He had some trouble on the move, and then Triple H gave Bulldog a pedigree. Mankind then turned on Rock doing a double arm DDT after the entire show building up that Mankind was afraid to beat Rock because the fans wouldn't like him if he did. He put the Socko Claw on Rock but Rock broke it with a rock bottom, but Triple H saved Mankind. Show choke slammed Mankind but all the refs pulled Corderis out of the ring and began pounding on him. Austin got up and was throwing all the refs around. Rock DDT'd Triple H for a great near fall with Austin counting. Rock used the rock bottom and people's elbow but Big Show pulled Austin out of the ring before he could count 3. Smith hit Rock with a chair. Austin then hit Smith with a chair, but Triple H used the pedigree on Rock and Austin grudgingly counted the pin, but after the match, then gave Triple H a stunner. 3.5 stars. Whatever questions were left about the skill and the heart of Frank Shamrock were answered with an amazing performance in what many were calling the best UFC match in history, his middleweight title victory over a much larger Tito Ortiz before 4,000 fans at Lake Charles, Louisiana Civic Center. Shamrock, going by the name Frank Juarez Shamrock in an attempt to market himself to the Mexican-American community, he is actually of Mexican descent and the Shamrock name, like with Ken, is an adopted name, faced a man much stronger than he was. He was perhaps insurmountably behind on the judges' scorecards in the late going, had his face covered with blood, but his superior conditioning paid off as the energy sapped from his rival. Shamrock unleashed a barrage of strikes standing, reminiscent of the finish of his win over Enson Inoue. As they went to the ground, Ortiz had more air taken from his lungs with an underhook smother, and was pounded literally into tapping out at 4:45 of the 4th round. It was a performance that left nearly everyone in awe. Despite it being somewhat known that this was going to be Shamrock's final UFC appearance and if he won, he'd vacate the title, announcer Jeff Blatnick and promoter Bob Merowitz after the match praised Shamrock as the greatest competitor in the history of the UFC, and with 5 title wins, he's undisputedly the most decorated. In Shamrock's last 10 matches, fighting under numerous different rules and against numerous different style fighters, most of which came with great reps and credentials, Shamrock has 9 wins. His lone blemish was a draw in rings against Kiyoshi Tamura in April, which, before this match, looked to be a strong candidate for Match of the Year. None of the wins came via the same finishing sequence as any of the others. All but one of the wins were against men that outweighed him, at least 3 of which were by more than 20 pounds. Nevertheless, because of the Shamrock name, his looks, and his reputation for being a great submission fighter who is easy to take down by a stronger wrestler, he was not as feared inside the cage as men like Vitor Belfort, with lesser records but scary punching prowess. In this match, his stand-up skills proved enough to not just negate, but eventually get the better of someone with substantial boxing training and who was nearly 5 inches taller, with the corresponding reach advantage, and much heavier. His heart had never been tested in UFC because most of his wins were quick, and the one that wasn't, against somewhat unheralded Jeremy Horn, was used as evidence that he got lucky in his first 2 wins with quick submissions. John LeBay, who scored a split decision win over Shamrock in his first NHB match when Shamrock gassed out first in a 30 minutes match, before their rematch 1 year ago in Brazil, claimed Shamrock would lose his heart as soon as he got hit, although Shamrock, showing vastly improved stand-up skills and better conditioning, handily won their rematch. LeBay, who was in Ortiz's corner after the match, came to Shamrock's dressing room and told him he was the best in the world. Ortiz, who had told friends there was no chance Shamrock could beat him, was shaking his head leaving the octagon with a similar reaction. A few moments later, Shamrock announced he was vacating his championship, and his plans for this to be his final UFC match were not a surprise going in. Shamrock's contract with Semaphore Entertainment Group called for him to have to publicly announce a retirement and vacate the title in order to fight elsewhere, or his non-compete expires next July. This enables him to negotiate with most likely a Japanese group for a more lucrative contract. It is believed he earned $50,000 for this match, with UFC Japan being the frontrunner and Pride also in the hunt. In a pro wrestling-like irony, because the first UFC Japan show will now air in the US on pay-per-view and there is a very good chance Shamrock will fight next on that show, fans saw him sort of retire, and may see him fight again only 7 weeks later. Shamrock looked tiny against Ortiz, even more so than it figured to be. While both weighed in at almost exactly the same weight the day before, that was misleading. Shamrock weighed 198, but came on the scale fully clothed and after his weight was announced, pulled a book out of his pocket. His real weight was 195. Ortiz, with experience as a college wrestler at cutting weight, came down from 222 2 days before the weigh-in, down to 199.9 for the weigh-in. After rehydrating, he was 217 pounds by early afternoon and was believed to have been between 220 and 222 by the time he stepped into the octagon. While in the early days of the UFC, skilled little guys could beat larger and more powerful wrestlers through submission skill, that is far more difficult nowadays with the elite fighters knowing how to avoid submissions. Since this match largely was combining kickboxing with wrestling, Shamrock was facing a talented man who in a sports context would have been at least 2 weight classes above him. Shamrock between fights sometimes gets as light as 185, while Ortiz between fights walks around at about 230, so despite what the scale read the night before, it was a huge body size difference. Roy Jones Jr. is considered by many as pound for pound the most talented man in boxing, and Buster Douglas is considered a mediocre washed-up heavyweight, but when that match presented itself last year, Jones was strongly advised to turn it down after first agreeing to it, which he did. Because even though he was the far superior fighter in boxing, he was thought to be giving up too much size. The atmosphere in Lake Charles, Louisiana before the most heated main event in years in UFC competition had similar sentiment. Actually, few wanted to make a prediction other than it figured to be a classic, but like with De La Hoya versus Trinidad, fights aren't fought on paper. The feeling was that Shamrock was too good and to many had a certain mystique which made it impossible to flat out predict he'd lose, but Ortiz was just too big and strong to logically lose to him unless he made a mental lapse or ran out of gas. The cutting weight and putting the weight back on over a few-day period figured to affect his stamina, but not early on. Others felt that Ortiz would physically dominate him, and pound on him most of the way leading to a decision. Actually, the fight itself was fairly predictable if it played out the way it should have and did. Ortiz and Shamrock would trade on their feet. Ortiz had superior reach but Shamrock had more stand-up skill. If Ortiz couldn't finish him quickly standing, and the odds were he wouldn't, the odds are he'd get more tired than Shamrock standing up and would move to take it to the ground. He was a good enough wrestler to impose his will, but on the ground, he could beat on Shamrock, but it would get frustrating because Shamrock's defense is so strong, and it was doubtful he could finish him, unless he cut him. At some point, probably after the third round, all bets were off because in a 25 minutes time limit, the guy in the best shape would take over. And that's what happened. Shamrock actually fought an almost perfect match, but the strategy still required Ortiz to get tired first. Even though he did, Shamrock's face was covered in blood, adding drama to the comeback for the live fans, and a bad cut stopping the match was the biggest danger of his planned strategy for that style of fight. Fortunately for him, the gash was at the hairline, and not dangerously close to the eye. Unfortunately for him, Ortiz, frustrated by the third round, several times dug his fingers into the cut to spread it, resulting in a wider and deeper gash that required several stitches. Between the blood and all the takedowns by Ortiz, Shamrock was far enough behind on the scorecards that if he hadn't finished Ortiz, he was most likely going to lose the decision. Going into the fourth and final round, unbeknownst to either fighter, 2 of the 3 judges had given Ortiz all 3 rounds, while the other had given him 2 of the 3 rounds. Barring a clean finish or a dominant 10-8 round being scored by one of the judges who at that point had it a sweep, Ortiz would have won the fight if he had been able to survive the last 2 rounds. If things had played out the way they looked, it would have been a decision booed heavily. While this was the second show under the new judging criteria, using the boxing 10-point must system for each round as opposed to simply the judges picking a winner, it was the first where the system was actually tested. The results from this perspective were not favorable. In the dark match opener that didn't air on television, Jens Pulitzer went to a draw with Alfonso Alcaraz after 2 rounds. 2 of the 3 judges had it 19-19, making it a majority draw. The third ruled it 20-18 for Pulitzer. I also had it 19-19 under the current system, as Pulitzer won the first round and Alcaraz the second. However, Pulitzer won the first round stronger than Alcaraz had won the second, and if just having to pick a winner without having to justify it by points, it would have been Pulitzer, who most at ringside felt deserved the win, although fans were accepting of the draw. Actually, there was a mistake initially in communication, because Pulitzer had his hand raised because of a misunderstanding about the majority draw rules, which was booed. Later, when it was announced it was actually a draw, the last thing fight fans want to hear, actually cheered. Later in the television opener, Ron Waterman drew with Tim Lasik in a 3-round fight. Again, my scorecard had a 28-28, with Waterman winning 2 of the 3 rounds, but losing a point because of a low blow in the first round. But having to pick a winner, and this was a close fight, under the old system my feeling is Waterman would have won. The third fight that went the distance, with wrestler Matt Hughes beating Sambo specialist Val Ignatov after 3 rounds, wasn't controversial since Hughes easily won all 3 rounds. Copying a system from boxing and kickboxing, which both have far more bad decisions than the more simple UFC pick a winner, may seem to a commission to make it more like a sport, but most commissions had their eyes closed to anything, and except in a few states, NHB hasn't picked up any ground despite all the problems, including the most recent death in boxing and escalating violence allowable on pro wrestling shows on free television directly marketed to children. Like UWFI, Pancrase and EFC, there is fear that UFC will go down in a similar blaze of a form of glory. All the preceding organizations got on pay-per-view and did well to start with. For a variety of reasons, they didn't hit. But the final show all 3 produced, long after the majority of viewers had given up on them, were excellent shows that almost nobody saw. Many were predicting that this would be UFC's similar final blaze of glory, since among UFC fans, this was the MMA equivalent to De La Hoya vs. Trinidad, and this one more than lived up to the hype. As things stand, the UFC show that as late as the afternoon of the pay-per-view was scheduled for November 19th in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi was cancelled. However, there will be a pay-per-view show taped on November 14th as the debut of the new UFC Japan promotion at Tokyo Bay NK Hall. The 2 are separate organizations with the exception of UFCJ leasing the rights to use the UFC name in Japan from Semaphore Entertainment Group. However, Semaphore Entertainment Group will use the UFCJ show to fill its November pay-per-view commitment rather than run a show of its own, which isn't considered a strong sign for the future. The lone active pro wrestler on the show, Brad Kohler, an independent wrestler out of Minnesota, scored a scary 31 seconds knockout with an overhand right over Steve Judson. Kohler, billed at 5'9", 234, who has a strong Greco-Roman background in wrestling and has a 15-4 MMA record, but being about as wide as he is tall, looks to be more like 5'6" or 5'7", all blown up like the early 80s version of Ivan Putski. He hit one of those punches that sounded like someone hitting the side of a jaw full force with a hammer, and Judson fell face first on the mat. This knockout was shown on the pay-per-view. It was originally a dark match, but they quickly cut off the tape not to show them administering oxygen and the scary panic after the punch. As it turned out, Judson was fine later in the evening, aside from a compound fracture of his jaw. Kohler in his interview mentioned training with Road Warrior Animal. Also at the show included both Akira Maeda and Tsuyoshi Kosaka of the Ring's organization, with Kosaka serving as one of Shamrock's cornermen. With the exception of the main event, most of the fighters on the card were getting $1,000 purses, which sounds low for being in a fight, and it is, but it's the reality of a decline in revenue due to the events not being shown on most pay-per-view systems and why from a name value standpoint this was really a one-match show. 1. Alfonso Alcaraz drew Jens Pulitzer over 2 rounds. These were the 2 smallest men ever in UFC, with Alcaraz, who boxes professionally at 122 pounds, and is also a strong amateur wrestler and ISCA champion kickboxer, coming in at 148 and Pulitzer 6 pounds heavier. Pulitzer was able to block Alcaraz shots in the first round and hit a lot of knees. In the second round, Alcaraz was able to throw a suplex and got the better of Pulitzer in what was mainly a clinch situation before finally taking him down, enabling him to win the round and take the draw. This was the second best match on the show. 2. Brad Kohler destroyed Steve Judson in 31 seconds. Kohler took Judson down, basically led him up, faked a second takedown which caused Judson to drop his hands, and Kohler landed the perfect shot. Both were about the same weight and total physical specimens if you get my drift, but Judson was at least 6 inches taller. Fans went nuts and UFC officials were hoping this impressive knockout would create a new Tank Abbott-like character. Abbott was at the show and with the possible exception of Shamrock, got the biggest crowd reaction of anyone. He also did something that has to be very impressive, especially in light of the WWF show 2 nights later. A big fight broke out in the audience and a few seconds in, Abbott impromptu jumped from his octagon side seat over the octagon fence and starting dancing around the ring. Everyone in the building turned their heads away from the fight and to see Abbott, even though there was nobody near him and no chance of violence, which speaks volumes for his stage presence. It also speaks volumes for WCW not knowing how to utilize him. By the way, Abbott reported he was still under a 3-year contract with WCW even though they've stopped using him. 3. Ron Waterman drew Tim Lasik after 3 rounds of a heavyweight match. Both these guys were good college wrestlers, with Lasik a 2-time Division II All-American and a former Golden Gloves boxing champ in California, but the H20 man, a Goldberg look-alike, held a 31-pound weight advantage. Waterman took him down in the first round and threw some punches from a side mount, and actually did a Mitsuharu Misawa-like facelock later in the round. Both guys got tired within 3 minutes, so it was more a battle of guts than skill. Waterman won the round, but lost his advantage when he threw a low blow after the round ended. In the second round, Lasik sprawled on Waterman's shot and spun around to control, but Waterman got a guard. Waterman took some punches, ending with a right eye almost swollen shut and a bloody nose. In the third round, Waterman was very slow on the takedown, but Lasik was equally tired and Waterman got him down and delivered short blows and pressed his forearm against Lasik's throat and face and basically made his life miserable until the time expired. 4. Matt Hughes beat Val Ignatov via unanimous decision after 3 rounds of a 170-pound match. Hughes is the current wrestling coach at Eastern Illinois University and a 4-time collegiate All-American, while Ignatov was a Sambo champion from Bulgaria, out of the Bob Shamrock camp. Pure Sambo was great in UFC's infancy when nobody knew how to block submissions, but Ignatov had no punch defense or standing skill and could be taken down at will. The one thing Ignatov did have was he had no fear of getting hit, and in that way was similar to Oleg Toktarov. Hughes suplexed him on his shoulder and Ignatov turned or would have landed on his head. Hughes threw a lot of blows, some hit and some didn't. In the second round, Ignatov went for a guillotine on Hughes' shot, but Hughes popped his head out and took him down and hit a lot of body shots. In the third round, Hughes came out throwing punches and staggered Ignatov, and eventually took him down in another guard. Hughes got a few effective punches in from the guard before time expired. 5. John Lewis beat Lowell Anderson in a match of 160-pounders via corner throwing in the towel at 15 seconds of the third round. Anderson was a 7-year student of Rorion Gracie in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and a former school policeman, so to speak. If people wanted to challenge, Anderson was used to accept challenges for the school. Like with the pure Sambo fighter, the weaknesses of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and not being an all-around fighter were exposed. Lewis was able to keep the fight standing and used his reach and superior boxing skill to dominate. Lewis staggered Anderson in the first round with punches. Lewis mainly danced and jabbed, with the fans booing the round. In the second round, after taking more of a beating, Anderson got the match to the ground by pulling Lewis down into a guard, but he couldn't do anything with him from there. In the third round, Anderson tried to surprise Lewis by coming out swinging, but Lewis countered with 3 knees and a kick, and Anderson was about to go down when the corner threw in the towel. 6. Jeremy Horn beat Jason Godsey in a heavyweight match in 208. Horn, who has fought in the 199-pound class in the past, was up to 229, against the 251-pound Pancrase veteran. Horn trapped Godsey in an armbar from the bottom. 7. Chuck Liddell beat Paul Jones in 338 in a 199-pound weight class match. Liddell is a former college wrestler with a kickboxing background, while Jones is an experienced and previously unbeaten shoot fighter from the USWF in Texas. Liddell was able to avoid the takedown, sprawling and throwing knees. Jones worked so hard to get takedowns that he used up his energy quickly. Jones was running low on gas when Liddell caught him with a left and opened a cut over the left eye, and the match was stopped. The fans didn't like the early stoppage, but the cut was right above the eye. 8. Shamrock beat Ortiz in 4:45 of the 4th round to retain the UFC middleweight title. The crowd heat and intensity at the start was bigger than any UFC main event match, probably dating back at least a year. The crowd appeared to be 70 to 80% pro Shamrock, and Ortiz was heavily booed. Surprisingly so coming out, since Ortiz's TV persona is that Steve Austin type role that gets over in most cities. There were a lot of signs in the crowd for Ortiz, but those were plants given out during the show by Ortiz's management. Ortiz came out with bare feet, which he's never done before, largely to make him less susceptible to leg locks. After a quick striking exchange, Ortiz overpowered Shamrock. Shamrock said Ortiz was the strongest opponent he had ever faced and said he was freaky strong, comparing his strength to that of Ken, and went for a German suplex. Shamrock blocked it, but Ortiz landed on the top and threw some punches. Shamrock was maneuvering from the bottom and came very close to getting an armbar, but Ortiz saw it coming and escaped. Shamrock threw some punches to the ear from the bottom to keep busier. Ortiz got a flurry in at 320 and held his position until the round ended. Clearly this was Ortiz's round and the crowd chanted for him. Ortiz took Shamrock down to start the second round. Shamrock was still much busier throwing ear punches from the bottom. Ortiz tried a flurry but never landed clean at one point, but got a few shots in later in the round. As the round came to an end, Shamrock got up and delivered an elbow to the kidney. Live I thought it was Ortiz's round, but watching it on television I'd say it was even. Shamrock scored with several leg kicks early before the distance was closed and Ortiz wound up on top, with Shamrock holding guard. Shamrock threw more blows from the bottom, but Ortiz dominated the positioning and Shamrock couldn't shake him. The crowd began sensing Ortiz was tiring and began a loud chant for Shamrock. Shamrock turned his back to set up a leg lock, but Ortiz didn't give him an opening and held on to the top position. Ortiz delivered a hard knee which opened a big gash over Shamrock's left eye, which bled heavily. Ortiz stuck his fingers into the cut and attempted to spread it, which resulted in a lot of blood being spilled. Shamrock got away and they had a good standing exchange before Ortiz took him down again. Shamrock was again busier from the bottom. At the end of the round, the cut was examined, but since it wasn't dangerous, the match continued. Shamrock opened the 4th round with more low kicks and Ortiz's knee was getting huge red welts. Shamrock kept the fight standing, and Ortiz did rock him with jabs, but Shamrock's leg kicks were doing more damage. Ortiz finally took him down and tried to get some blows in, but most were blocked. Shamrock reversed him as Ortiz started to tire. When they got back to their feet, Shamrock unleashed a barrage of punches in the corner. Ortiz shot in again and Shamrock caught him in a front headlock, trying to smother his breathing, taking what air was left away from him. When he dropped the move, he threw a hard elbow and a series of punches at Ortiz, who tapped out. After the match, as he had promised if he lost, Ortiz put on a Shamrock t-shirt. In his previous wins he'd put on some negative t-shirts rubbing in his wins at the Lion's Den. Shamrock told him he'd train him for a match with Boss Rutan, which is expected at some point for the middleweight title he was leaving behind. Frank wasn't the only Shamrock in the news this past week. Ken Shamrock suffered a neck injury which caused him to miss the WWF pay-per-view, and could make his much-talked-about return to reality fighting in jeopardy. The injury was diagnosed as a slip disc in the cervical cord, which was putting pressure on the spine. The doctors have talked of therapy through use of traction, and in the worst-case scenario, surgery. The latter would end any thoughts of making a fighting comeback. While in high school, Shamrock suffered a broken neck and at the time was told he'd never be able to return to competitive sports. In addition, another former UFC champion who made it big in pro wrestling, Don Fry, went out of his way to issue a public challenge to Shamrock for his proposed return. Shamrock apparently suffered the neck injury on September 13 in Anaheim, California when during a run-in he took a stiff kick from Curtis Hughes, which caused him to blow his stack backstage. The neck got stiff as the week went on and he wanted an MRI done, while the office pressured him to work the weekend house shows, and he got his doctor to send a note saying he couldn't wrestle. He went on tour and got an MRI done in Houston on September 20, but didn't get the results back until September 22, at which time he was told not to wrestle because one bad fall at this point could end his career, which explained why he worked on September 21 in Dallas for SmackDown against Chris Jericho in the First Blood match. There is no time frame for a return to pro wrestling, if at this point there will even be a return before he goes into fighting again. Shamrock, who turns 36 in February, has talked of devoting one final year to fighting, either with UFC, with Pride in Japan, or to be the top drawing card if Vince McMahon starts his own MMA group next year, the latter of which really at this point isn't past the talking stages. The original idea of him returning for the proposed return to prominence of UFC for a December show in Las Vegas was curtailed by UFC not having the votes to get approval in Nevada, the approval which is apparently necessary to get back on pay-per-view. Without that approval, UFC events don't generate nearly enough revenue to where Semaphore Entertainment Group could pay Shamrock what it would seemingly be worth for his taking time off wrestling. Fry, who sported a 10-1 record in MMA competition including winning 2 tournaments, with his biggest accomplishment winning the 1996 Ultimate Tournament, his last competition before signing with New Japan, challenged Shamrock in the current issue of Full Contact Fighter magazine. The interview was clearly at least partially a pro wrestling interview designed to build up a fight that could be a money fight in either the US or Japan. Fry said that while he has an exclusive contract with New Japan, that New Japan gave him permission to take one fight with UFC, and said he's risking his career if he gets the match. Fry claimed he wanted to fight Shamrock winner take all, and claimed Shamrock was the most overrated guy out there and took a knock at Shamrock's WWF character as the world's most dangerous man. He knocked Shamrock for what he did to his father. The two had a personal falling out, saying that Bob Shamrock took Ken off the street and turned him into something and Ken turned his back on him, saying he wanted Bob in his corner if he fought Ken. Shamrock's feelings on the interview were that he understood trying to build up a fight for business but thought that bringing Bob into the story wasn't business. He also knocked Ken for knocking Dan Gable, which he actually never did. That was actually Mikey Burnett, one of Shamrock's fighters, who did a pro wrestling heel interview at the UFC show in Iowa where Gable, and probably the biggest sports legend in the state, apparently drunk, in which he knocked Gable. Fry complained of Shamrock's rep as one of UFC's all-time great fighters because he never won a tournament. Shamrock was in 3 tournaments, losing to Hoist Gracie in the first one, and bowing out due to injuries in the other 2, one of which was the 1996 Ultimate that Fry won, where it appeared Shamrock was the most talented fighter in the tournament by his performance in his win over current New Japan wrestler Brian Johnston, where he suffered a hand injury that kept him from continuing, which also turned out to be Shamrock's last UFC match before signing with WWF after turning down a similar New Japan deal which Fry got. Fry claimed he never got respect for his UFC record, which on paper with 2 tournament wins and his record is superior to Shamrock's 6'2" UFC record. Both draws would have most likely been wins had judging been implemented at that point in time, and claims Shamrock's UFC rep was unmerited. Looking at their overall records in more depth looks to give the nod to Shamrock, since Fry's biggest wins were over .500 record heavyweights Gary Goodridge and Tank Abbott. Fry is highly respected in that world for being an exciting fighter with a lot of guts and heart. Shamrock's biggest wins were over Dan Severn, who had one of the best records of any heavyweight in MMA. In addition, during his tenure in Pancrase he had the best record of any fighter of that period when it came to real matches, including twice beating current UFC heavyweight champ Bas Rutten, who also has one of the best legitimate competition records around, by a submission. Just how much damage New Japan did in Tokyo from that disastrous main event on the August 28 Jingu Stadium show with Great Muta vs Great Nita became evidence this past week when the finals of the annual tag team tournament bombed at Budokan Hall. Scott Norton and Keiji Muto won the tournament, beating Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi in something of a mind-boggling finish, Muto making Nakanishi submit, which makes no sense given that Nakanishi is to challenge Muto for the IWGP title at the Tokyo Dome on October 11. But the big story was the crowd, announced publicly at 9,000 but in reality roughly 7,000, or slightly less than a half house. It was the smallest New Japan crowd at the building in at least 20 years. Part of the problem can be explained because New Japan was pushing its Tokyo Dome show with the long-awaited Shinya Hashimoto vs Naoya Ogawa in the market, Although it's a weak explanation since New Japan has often promoted multiple shows in the Tokyo market at the same time without having trouble filling buildings. New Japan was also without its biggest drawing card down the stretch, with Masahiro Chono suffering the herniated disc in his lower back, but that's not a valid excuse for the show bombing either since Chono has been injured and out of action a great deal over the past year. The round-robin tournament ended on September 22nd in Maebashi with the following standings: 1. Muto and Norton 7 and 1, 2. Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Satoshi Kojima and Nagata and Nakanishi 5 and 3, 4. Shinya Hashimoto and Meng and Junji Hirata and Shiro Koshinaka 4 and 4, 6. Masahiro Chono and Don Frye, Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto and Brian Johnston and Takashi Iizuka 3 and 5, 9. Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuyuki Fujita 2 and 6. Nagata and Nakanishi went into the 9/22 show with a 5 and 2 record, while Tenzan and Kojima were 4 and 3. However, Nagata and Nakanishi lost to Hirata and Koshinaka, and then Tenzan and Kojima in the main event on the show in Maebashi beat Fujita and Sasaki, causing a tie for second place and the right to face Muto and Norton, who had days earlier clinched the final spot. The injury to Chono most likely changed everything around, as it appeared the tournament was built around a tag feud with Muto and Norton versus Chono and Frye. This left Nagata and Nakanishi beating Kojima and Tenzan in 13:42 of a good match when Nagata pinned Tenzan after a bridging back suplex. In the final, which went 21-32, mainly working over Muto's legit bad knees. The finish saw Nakanishi again have Muto up for the rack, the same move he beat him with to win the G1 tournament, and Muto maneuvered off his back into an armbar for the submission. It's hard to figure out that finish, unless Nakanishi is actually going to win the IWGP title, which would be a mistake of immense proportions, as it would have made a perfect ending to their dome match. With Nakanishi having been tapped out by Muto before getting his title shot, and with Nakanishi, despite his G1 Climax tournament win, still not being seen by the casual fans as a real world title contender, having him lose before the title match was a strange booking decision. Paced by the biggest opposed quarter hour in history, which beat its competition by nearly 7 ratings points, Raw beat Nitro by the biggest head-to-head margin in history on September 27. A 20-minute-long segment spoofing a famous television show of the past called This Is Your Life on the Rock drew a mind-boggling 8.39 quarter. The skit featured actors and actresses brought in as Rock's former home EC teacher, former football coach and former high school girlfriend. It certainly wasn't sports, and it would be hard-pressed to call it entertainment, as if came off like one of those Saturday Night Live skits that goes forever with no punch, although Rock did get to lay the verbal smackdown. Actually, the segment with the high school girlfriend where Rock was getting her back for cutting him off at second base was pretty funny, and Mankind did have some good lines. WCW, with the beginning of a Perry Saturn vs. Conan match in opposition, drew a record low 1.58 quarter in opposition. To show it was the Rock segment that was so good and not Conan vs. Saturn that was so bad, the portion of the Conan vs. Saturn match that aired after the Rock segment ended immediately jumped back to a 2.40 and Raw dropped correspondingly. For the night, Raw did one of its best marks in history, a 6.77 rating, 6.54 first hour, 6.98 seconds hour, and a 10.0 share. Nitro did a 3.03 rating, 4.12 first hour, 2.43 seconds hour, 2.61 third hour, and a 4.5 share. The San Francisco 49ers vs. Phoenix Cardinals game on ABC drew a 13.28 rating and 22.3 share, making it the first week this season where the wrestling audience, growing about a half point from what it had been doing, seemed to bite a chunk out of the football rating, which was more than 2 points below its seasonal average. Nitro has adopted some new booking policies, which this show was the first example of. There were primitive Raw-like storylines throughout the show, with him getting attacked twice by Sting, being taken out in an ambulance, and of course showing up at the end of the show to make the big heroic comeback. It was almost a cliché, since it's the same angle Raw has done so many times with Austin and McMahon in babyface roles. They also did a campy deal, and not good camp, where Goldberg had Sid Vicious car smashed to bits. But the two major focuses are now to load up the first unopposed hour, which has regained much of the audience lost when Kevin Nash's booking attempts at being high-concept whittled the first-hour audience down to unprecedented low levels, and to go longer at the end than Raw, thus picking up some audience at the end. Nitro went 4 minutes longer than Raw, thus with people flipping over at the end. Fans get to see their blow-off or cliffhanger endings with hopes it'll get some fans interested in sticking with the show. In addition, the promotion is wanting to focus more on wrestling in the ring and having good matches because it's believed it's the one facet where it has the talent to be superior to its opposition. Bill Bush had one-on-one talks with many of the wrestlers, who pointed to the same problems about the younger wrestlers not getting a break, so the pressure was put on the booking committee to elevate and create new stars. However, Raw absolutely destroyed Nitro head-to-head over the 2 hours and 5 minutes by a record 6.77 to 2.40 margin, doubling Nitro in every quarter and tripling it in 2 quarters. Besides the aforementioned record-setting quarter, Raw also tripled Nitro during the second quarter with a 6.62 rating for Big Show vs Jericho, while Nitro countered with Karagi's vs Berlin and the beginning of Heat vs Wyndham's doing a 2.13. In the battle of the main events, Raw's Helmsley vs Rock title match drew a 6.05 final quarter and a 7.00 overrun. Nitro's Hart and Flair vs Sting and Luger and Page did a 2.96 final quarter and improved to a 3.77 overrun, although with 4 of those minutes going unopposed, the actual rating against the 7.00 opposed was closer to 3.2, maintaining the greater than 2-1 margin. WCW's high point unopposed was a 4.64 quarter, which for WCW these days is a strong number, for Malenko vs Mysterio Jr. and the beginning of Goldberg vs Morris. In more good news for WWF, SmackDown on September 23 featuring Triple H wrestling 5 times maintained most of the audience gained the week before by the Vince McMahon title win, doing a 4.28 rating and 6.9 share, and this was going against first-run network programming. The Live Thunder drew a 2.17 rating and 3.4 share. The September 16th show with the McMahon title win saw SmackDown jump to number 75 out of 114 prime-time shows for the week. It remained UPN's top-rated show, 4.55, by a wide margin. Its second highest rating was a 2.8, but UPN fell well below WB, which debuted its new shows in the battle for last place. For the first time, SmackDown also beat a network show, as ABC's Up Close and Personal special from 9 and 10 p.m. only did a 3.5 rating, and overall for the 2 hours UPN beat ABC's 4.4. For the weekend figures, Livewire did a 1.9 rating, Superstars did a 2.2 and Heat inexplicably fell to a 3.24 rating, down more than a full point from the previous week. WCW Saturday Night drew a 1.5 rating. After pulling an unusually low rating the previous week, ECW picked up 32% on September 24 to a 0.95 rating and 1.7 share, its second best mark of its 5 shows to date. Even stranger is Roller Jam, which had its season high the previous week when ECW had its season low, was down 18% to a 0.56. Apparently ECW apologists attempted to blame the low rating on Hurricane Floyd, but that explanation makes no sense since Roller Jam did its best number of the season that same night following ECW, and most importantly, the HUT levels, total people watching television of all shows during that hour, for the previous week were exactly the same as they had been the previous 4 weeks, so the hurricane itself made zero difference in the number of people watching television that night. If something like a catastrophe was statistically significant enough to make the rating difference, the share would stay constant with what it had been the previous weeks because fewer people are watching television, even though the rating would fall. And the share on September 17th for ECW was down the same level as the rating. Actually, on September 24th, for whatever reason, probably the debut of a lot of new fall shows on the networks, there were 12% more viewers watching than over the previous month, which explains a little more than 1/3 of ECW's increase from last week, but not the other 2/3. Even though the rating was the second highest of the 5, the share was actually the 4th highest of the 5, but for a wrestling promoter, the share isn't important. For a TV station it is because it measures how the show does for its time slow against competition. It's the total viewers that are important because those are your potential number of customers. There is no definite word regarding the OGAWA vs Hashimoto match being an NWA title match. There was a Japanese newspaper that listed it, and the word at the New Japan Tag Tourney Finals at Budokan was it would be a title match. As the NWA title itself changed hands on September 25th in Charlotte at the company's 51st anniversary show before a crowd which was said to have had 1/3 tickets sold to the Grady Cole Center, but it looked more like about 700 as a generous estimate live, with most estimates less than that. Ogawa was in a 3-way dance with Brian Anthony of Pittsburgh and Gary Steele of the United Kingdom. The finish saw Ogawa have Anthony beaten with a submission, but immediately at that finish with Anthony eliminated, Steele came from behind and schoolboyed Ogawa, and they did a fast count finish, since the show was heavily covered by the Japanese press and needed to create a scenario where it seemed Ogawa didn't lose fairly. People live actually believed Ogawa was getting double-crossed on the finish since everyone played it up that way. The current plan is that the title will go back to Ogawa on October 2nd in a singles match against Steele on a Tony Rumble show in Thomaston, Connecticut, which means that Ogawa will be champion going into the Dome show. The main obstacle in making it a title match is the WCW/New Japan business relationship, and with Eric Bischoff out of the picture, nobody knows how that relationship will turn out because a lot of the connection was the Minnesota connection of Bischoff with Brad Rheingans and Masa Saito. Tatsumi Fujinami was to meet with Bill Bush, and this may have been one of the topics, and they've also teased the possibility of Fujinami refereeing the match, which would make sense because they could work a finishing spot where Ogawa would lose. In order to restore Hashimoto's reputation, he either has to make a super showing and have a great match, or win outright. Not only would New Japan have to okay an NWA title match as a Dome show main event, giving the NWA belt a great deal of credibility in Japan once again, but if Hashimoto is supposed to go over, he would have to get the title. For the NWA itself, this again creates a title which most of the NWA members would have little access to booking the champ, and at some point would require Hashimoto, if he's going to have a lengthy reign, to tour. However, for the NWA title itself, having the belt around the waist of Hashimoto, one of pro wrestling's biggest stars of the decade, does elevate the prestige of the title, if such a thing still can even exist in today's wrestling world. Also at the 51st anniversary weekend, the NWA elected new offices, with Howard Brody of Tampa once again as president, Bill Behrens of Atlanta as vice president, Antonio Inoki as director of international affairs and expansions, and the remainder of the board of directors are Ernie Todd, Canada, Jim Miller, Pittsburgh, Slim Baucom, NWA Mid-Atlantic, and Dennis Coraluzzo, New Jersey, with alternate board members being Ken Taylor, Texas, and Rich O'Brien, New York. The NWA, an organization which now has 25 members, mainly smaller indie promoters in the US and Canada, although also having members overseas in Japan and the United Kingdom, is trying to work together on a national basis as opposed to being a group of small regional promoters. They've increased the initiation fee into the organization from $500 to $3,000, although the annual dues for members to renew remains $100. In another strange deal at the show, they held a tag team tournament, won by Team Extreme, Kit Carson and Chris Germany from Texas, to get a shot at NWA tag champs the Brotherhood, Dukes Dalton and Knuckles Nelson, from New England, later in the show. Carson and Germany won the belts in the final match on the show, by which time, maybe 400 fans or less were left in the building since Ogawa and Abdullah the Butcher, the two major names on the show, were on earlier. What makes it strange is that 3 days earlier in Somerville, Massachusetts, Nelson and Dalton had dropped those same belts on an NWA New England show to Curtis Slamdog and Jay Cobain. Basically, NWA New England ran its own angle for its own television and territorial purposes to make it appear the champions within its own territory were the lineal rightful champs. There was frustration within that promotion because at the 50th convention, the promoters agreed to support and promote the company's belts, and as it turned out, only one or two outside promoters ever booked the Brotherhood, including those who run NWA shows within driving distance for the duo to where trans wouldn't be a major issue. Among the major names from the past at the show besides Abdullah, who did an angle with Ogawa for the Japanese photographers backstage, were Swede Hansen, Tommy Young, Penny Banner, Don, and Rocky Coronado, Abe Jacobs, and Nelson Royal. Wahoo McDaniel, Lou Thez and Ricky Steamboat were also there for an afternoon autograph session, although Thez left the show before intermission when he was to be presented with an award. Hansen, Royal and McDaniel were all in poor health. The unmasking of Shocker as Yer Soria climaxed EMLL's 66th anniversary show on September 24th at Arena Mexico before a nearly full house of more than 15,000 fans. After the disastrous house the previous week, coming off the stabbing death of wrestler Sergio Villa, Cronus, coming home from the arena during the week, there was fear that the anniversary show might be a tough draw, and the death probably meant the difference in the show failing to sell out. The lengthy main event, which lasted more than 35 minutes on television, and even then was noticeably edited, started out as a tag match with rival partners that have been feuding almost all year, Atlantis and Villano Tercero against Mr. Niebla and Shocker. After some blood dives and mask ripping, Villano Tercero turned on Atlantis, causing him to get pinned for the deciding fall. Villano Tercero then picked Shocker up and carried him on his shoulders. Shocker did the same, and Villano Tercero, from the shoulders, executed a Rana on Shocker and pinned him. Atlantis ran in and attacked three, and they brawled all over the place. This led to Shocker versus Niebla. Shocker delivered what was reported as an incredible tope, which wiped out the first two rows of ringside. The fans were waving towels to revive the wrestlers to get back in the ring. After a series of near falls and near submissions, Shocker kicked Niebla low. Shocker went for the pin with his legs on the ropes, and the ref counted 3. At this point, Commissioner Ray Mendoza jumped into the ring and ordered the match restarted. About 40 seconds after the match restarted, Niebla got Shocker in La Nieblina, his finisher, which is an upside-down nudo. With Shocker caught, he actually kissed the mat, as a symbolic kissing of his gimmick goodbye, and then submitted with all the pyro going off. The pop for the finish was said to be bigger than the pop when Niebla beat the other Niebla for the name. Shocker then took off his mask and gave it to Niebla and shook his hand, and then grabbed the mic and basically said that while he may have lost, he's still the best looking. Yair Soria was announced as being from Guadalajara. He actually grew up in Cerritos, California, which is a Los Angeles suburb, and is 27 years old and a 7-year pro, starting his career in the Guadalajara circuit, and was the final major trainee of the late Diablo Velasco. The card opened with Super Astro and Starman and Tony Rivera over Violencia and Rincor Latino and Virus in a best-of-3 fall match. In a 1-fall match, Ricky Marvin and Sombra de Plata beat Fugaz and Sangre Azteca. The new Infernales, El Satanico and Ultimo Guerrero and Rey Bucanero beat Emilio Charles Jr. and the Headhunters via DQ in the 3rd fall when Satanico faked like he was kicked low and the ref called the non-foul. The WWF's Val Venus returned in the 4th match on the card, as Steel, the name he held the CMLL World Heavyweight title under a few years back. Steel and Scorpio Jr. and Apollo Dantes and Universo 2000 lost a 1-fall match to Gigante Silva and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Brazo de Plata in a 3-on-4 match. Most of the focus of the match was continuing Rayo versus Universo, who are still building to a mask versus mask match at some point. Steel was announced as being now known as Val Venus, and cut a Spanish in-ring promo. If there was still money in Mexico, the reports are that Steel could easily be the best heel in the company. Silva did a splash off the top rope more than halfway across the ring onto Universo and Steel both for the pin. It was announced that Steel would be returning in October for the 6th annual International Grand Prix tournament, and that Silva would also be in the tournament. In the semifinal, Dr. Wagner Jr. and Blue Panther and Fuerza Guerrera beat El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas and Olympico, a best-of-3 fall match when Casas pulled off Wagner's mask for a DQ in the 3rd fall of what was said to have been a good match. There was many celebrities and politicians at the show, and there was a huge fight involving hundreds of spectators during the Santo match, with Hill fans getting into it with the regular fans. Because of the problems after the death of the wrestler last week, EMLL promoted heavily there would be added security at the show, and they were able to stop the huge fight fairly quickly. This card will air in the US on Galavision on October 2nd. The E! channel did a heavily publicized 1-hour special called Inside Pro Wrestling, which aired on September 26th, which was neither inside, nor showed any insight. The show featured short features on various subjects in pro wrestling, including the Wrestling War, the Nitro Girls, the same Ventura, California kids doing their backyard wrestling, along with David Fleming, an amateur wrestling reporter who works for Sports Illustrated, heavily ripping pro wrestling, and a few academic types, one a fan, one who wasn't, but both of whom came across as clueless. The show was wrapped around the host, Todd Newton, training with some of Rick Baseman's students in Southern California, including Nils Allen Stewart, whose main claim to fame is he played Jesse Ventura in that really bad NBC bio movie which, despite Newton's overplayed pain in taking bumps, actually made doing it seem easy and something of a joke, although somewhat painful. Stewart was billed as one of the country's top wrestling trainers, with the claim he's trained 5 wrestlers in the past year who have signed WWF contracts. Actually, Baseman has been very good at recruiting people, both men and women, who have the kind of look, in particular the physique, that the WWF is interested in. He was the person who first discovered and set up training for both Jim Hellwig and Steve Borden, and came up with their original power team gimmick, and getting them developmental deals, although their deals are more because they have a good look and are seen by WWF as raw projects as opposed to having world-class training. Fleming talked of the popularity of pro wrestling as an example of the end of society, and claimed that amateur wrestlers really train, while pro wrestlers sit around, get a tan and get their hair done. He claimed that an average college heavyweight could make most pro wrestlers cry uncle in 30 seconds, missing the point that it is entertainment to sell tickets any way possible, and not sport where legitimate wrestling ability is a major criteria in the first place, and who would win in a real match is irrelevant. Besides, there are pro wrestlers, such as Ken Shamrock, who through their submission ability, would be able to beat almost any college wrestler who hasn't had specific training in avoiding submissions in a pure non-striking cry uncle situation, and would beat most of them easier if striking was allowed, In a relatively short period of time, and Frank Shamrock in 1997 made Olympic team members Dan Henderson and Kevin Jackson both tap within 1 minute in competition, and would do the same to most any top-level professional boxer. So by that logic, Fleming should be giving tons of coverage to UFC competition as opposed to pro boxing, the NCAA wrestling tournament, or wrestling in the Olympics. The piece interviewed many WCW wrestlers, most prominently Bill Goldberg, Diamond Dallas Page, and Randy Savage, with all three coming across roughly the same as they do on most interviews. Goldberg is this normal guy who through some fluke he can't even figure out made it huge in this world he really never aspired to be a part of. Page is the same self-promoter we always see, and Savage is the middle-aged guy who can't leave his character behind. It also had many clips of Eric Bischoff speaking for WCW, with no mention that he's since been bounced from the company. Some clips of Vince and Shane McMahon were there, with Vince saying the same basic things about the promotional war that he always says. The main point men for history were Lou Albano and Bert Sugar, so you can imagine what their version of history was between them and the McMahons. According to the special, pro wrestling history post-television went something like this. In the 50s, pro wrestling was huge on television, and in particular noted the popularity of Gorgeous George. When Wild West cowboy television shows started getting popular, it hurt pro wrestling, which then lost television. That's the first time I've ever heard cowboy television shows credited with the demise of pro wrestling on television. It was more than 20 years later when a young promoter, Vince McMahon Jr., came up with the idea of doing storylines for pro wrestling feuds, that Vince sure was a genius coming up with that concept, which resulted in pro wrestling drawing big television ratings. Seeing that pro wrestling with the new concept of storylines was doing big ratings, Ted Turner wanted to get into the wrestling business and tried to buy the WWF. They wouldn't sell. So Ted Turner joined with Eric Bischoff and Dr. Harvey Schiller to create WCW, stealing McMahon's top talent in the process. Bischoff claimed that when WCW was beating WWF in the ratings, they resorted to Shock TV to rebuild their ratings, while McMahon claimed their wrestlers perform with more passion and they work harder than WCW at putting together the product. That last sentence was the closest thing to insight in the entire 60-minute show, which also featured kids rolling around on a mat in a park hitting each other with the worst chair shots in history, Kimberly talking about the success of the Nitro Girls, and the media's stereotypical fans at a Nitro event which made all wrestling fans look like toothless morons. The World Wrestling Federation was granted a temporary restraining order against Playboy magazine after a court hearing on September 22 to keep the magazine from publishing an already in-print cover for the Ultimate Sable newsstand magazine using the line on the cover, "The woman you loved as Sable in the Raw." WWF attorneys argued that Sable and Raw were trademarked WWF terms, and also argued that the cover photo of Rena Mero saw her dress as her Sable character. Manhattan Federal District Court Judge Loretta Priska ruled in their favor. Playboy will still be marketing the 96-page Rena Mero magazine, but has to reprint it with a new cover design. Seriously, while WWF is on the right side in this argument regarding the name Sable and appears to have a strong case against the magazine for the second Sable issue for promoting it as Sable without getting WWF permission, using the term Sable in the Raw, as in lowercase Raw, which would be synonymous with naked and not with a Monday night television show, being a protected WWF trademark term, and the judge ruling that way is really stretching things. The judge ruled Playboy could not put on the cover any photo drawing or facsimile of such showing Rena Mero with black gloves in combination with black attire, including a black bathing suit, with wearing tinted glasses or sunglasses. They could not use the word Raw in conjunction with any depiction or photo of Rena Mero. The word Sable without surrounding words modifying it to denote a historical context would be outlawed. The judge allowed Playboy to use, formerly the character Sable on its new cover since formerly denotes a historical context. Playboy was also ordered by the court to post a $500,000 bond on September 28. The new design, which may delay the release of the magazine for a few days past its originally scheduled October 19 release, shows Mero on the cover in a white bra. The WWF also has a lawsuit against Playboy for the September 1999 issue, for using the name and trademark term Sable throughout the magazine and on the cover without WWF approval, as well as advertising the issue as Sable 2, the rematch, including on a Times Square billboard. In the lawsuit, the WWF claimed it sent cease and desist letters regarding this problem dating back to June. In addition, WWF has been given express representations by the lawyers for Rena Mero that she did not give permission to Playboy to use the Sable name. The WWF acknowledged they had given Playboy rights to use the Sable name in the April 1999 issue as a one-time appearance. It noted that in the September issue, She is referred to as Sable in every reference but one, which lists her as Rena Mero, and WWF said the cover photo of that issue was Mrs. Mero wearing a form of dress that would be considered part of the WWF's intellectual property as Sable. In addition, on its website, Playboy advertised the September issue as a pictorial of Sable, as it did at its July Playboy convention. WWF is asking for actual damages, disgorgement of Playboy's profits from the September issue and the upcoming issue, as well as punitive damages for Playboy ignoring warnings. No specific dollar fee is listed in the lawsuit. Mexico. We're told the television that airs this weekend, both EMLO Saturday, which is the anniversary show, and AAA Monday, which is the September 17th Juan de la Barrera Gym show, are must-see. In particular, the cage match from Juan de la Barrera Gym with Heavy Metal, Octagon, Jockmate and Kickboxer, where Kickboxer lost his mask, was said to have been great. The finish saw Tirantes turning babyface, which is the biggest AAA angle so far this year, when the heels attacked his son Tirantes Jr. and destroyed him, with his son doing one of the all-time great blade jobs, leading to his father making the save fighting against the Kickboxer team, giving Heavy Metal nunchucks which allowed him to pound down Kickboxer when they were the two left in the cage. Apparently this match showed that Metal, when he's on, is still among the best workers in the business. After the match, longtime rivals Tirantes and Tropicazes hugged each other. October 1st Arena Mexico top 2 matches are Atlantis and Mr. Niebla and Negro Casas vs. Shocker and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Villano Tercero and Gigante Silva and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Brazo de Plata vs. Apollo Dantes and Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. and Zumbido. Blue Demon Jr. has a mask vs. mask match, which means rival Black Demon will be losing his mask, on October 1st in Tijuana. Valente Perez 75, the longtime editor of the now-defunct Lucha Libre magazine during the glory days of the mag in the 50s and 60s, passed away on September 20th at his home in Miami. He had moved to the U.S. in retirement in 1985. There will be more on this in the readers' pages, but Perez magazine featured cartoons where he'd create fictitious wrestling babyface masked superheroes, created the original cartoon characters of both Mil Mascaras and Tinieblas, and later they found bodybuilders to play their roles when the cartoon characters became movie characters, and trained the men later to become wrestlers, and they became 2 of the all-time Mexican wrestling legends. As part of a settlement for threatened legal action, Zumbido was forced to apologize in print to a Televisa cameraman who he nailed with a tope on the September 10th show. Also on the September 17th Juan de la Barrera Gym show, Los Vipers Primera Clase, AAA Mosco de la Merced and Hysteria and AAA Psicosis and Maniaco won the National Atomicosh 4-man team title over Los Juniors, La Parca Jr. and Pero Aguayo Jr. and Blue Demon Jr. and Mascara Sagrada Jr. On the September 21st Arena Coliseo show before about 5,000 fans, Archangel retained the CMLL welterweight title, beating Pantera. New Japan. Besides the tag team tournament matches, the major matches of the Budokan Hall flop on September 23rd saw Genichiro Tenryu and Don Fry beat Brian Johnston and Kensuke Sasaki in 12:27 when Sasaki accidentally clotheslined Johnston and Tenryu pinned him after a brainbuster and a lariat in what was said to have been a good match. Kendo Kashin retained the IWGP Junior title, beating Tatsuhito Takaiwa in 15:18 with a reverse armbar in what was said to have been a disappointing match. Kashin came out with a new title belt and after the match took the original title belt and began stomping on it, which I guess was an angle to build heat for his Tokyo Dome match against Jushin Liger, who held the original belt more times than anyone. Liger earlier in the show pinned Akira with a brainbuster at 11:11. Most of the match saw Akira work over Liger's bad knee. Meng and Shinya Hashimoto beat Tatsumi Fujinami and Shiro Koshinaka in 10:58 when Hashimoto used a crooked head scissors to submit Koshinaka. 2 new matches were officially added to the October 11th Dome show, which only confirm it as really being a one-match show. Hiroyoshi Tenzan vs. Tatsutoshi Goto will be the opener, while they added Koshinaka and Fujinami vs. Takashi Iizuka and Osamu Kido as a mid-card match nobody will care about. For whatever this is worth, the Keiji Muto vs. Manabu Nakanishi match is being put in the main event position, even though Hashimoto vs. Naoya Ogawa is clearly the match that is the draw, I guess to try and make the IWGP title belt seem as the most important thing in the promotion. The Dome show won't air on TV Asahi until October 16th at the prime time slot of 2:10 to 3:40 a.m., so don't expect any record ratings out of this one. On this weekend's television, Masa Saito in commentary said that Riki Choshu has been training hard with Nakanishi, both to push Nakanishi as a title contender and also to push Choshu's return, which appears to be at the January 4th Tokyo Dome show, possibly in a tag match with Fujinami against Tenryu and Atsushi Onita. Choshu, when he retired on January 4, 1998, said the only way he'd come back would be if the company business was so bad it was needed, so you can read into all that what you will. Fry did an interview saying the reason he was training Hashimoto is because he hates Ogawa. They announced lineups for the major shows on the next tour. With the exception of Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko spicing up the mid-cards, there's really nothing newsworthy to speak of. October 17th at Kobe World Memorial Hall has Koji Kanemoto vs Malenko, Liger vs Wild Pegasus, Benoit, Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani vs Dr. Wagner Jr. and Kashin, Hiro Saito and Tenzan vs Michiyoshi Ohara and Goto, Yuji Nagata and Nakanishi vs NWO Sting and Masahiro Chono and Sasaki and Hashimoto vs Muto and Satoshi Kojima. October 17th in Fukuoka at Kakusai Center has Kashin vs Malenko, Kanemoto vs Wagner Jr., Liger and Pegasus vs Otani and Takaiwa, Nakanishi and Koshinaka vs Ohara and Goto, Tadao Yasuda and Hashimoto vs Nagata and Sasaki and Muto, and Tenzan vs NWO Sting and Chono. October 25th in Nagasaki has Junji Hirata and Hashimoto vs Ohara and Goto, Sasaki and Kazuyuki Fujita vs Nagata and Nakanishi and Muto and Kojima, and Tenzan vs NWO Sting and Chono and Michael Wall Street. The tour ends on November 1st in Hiroshima with Takaiwa vs Wagner Jr., Kashin vs Otani, Hiro Saito and Tenzan vs Ohara and Goto, Nagata and Hashimoto vs Yasuda and Sasaki, Liger and Fujinami vs Kanemoto and Koshinaka, and Muto and Kojima vs Chono and Akira. Fujinami came to the US this past weekend after the tour to meet with Bill Bush in Atlanta and with Inoki in Los Angeles. It was finally publicly revealed this week in Weekly Pro Wrestling that Osamu Nishimura, 28, who has been out of action for more than 1 year, has been fighting cancer. It wasn't a secret on the inside, but it was never announced publicly as Japanese culturally don't like to talk about cancer. Other Japan notes. There has been a lot more news regarding the FMW show on November 23rd at Yokohama Arena, the company's major show of the year. Shawn Michaels will appear as referee. So many people sense this as similar to Steve Williams, in that WWF is trying to change Michaels' contract since he has a $750,000 per year deal and can't wrestle, and as things stand right now they don't want to use him, so are probably trying to change or get out of the deal. Also, Dory and Terry Funk will work as a tag team in Japan on this show for the first time since the 1987 World Tag League Tournament. Several ECW wrestlers are scheduled as well. The top 2 matches look to be Original Hayabusa Unmasked versus Fake Hayabusa, Mr. Ganasuke, and a loser leaves FMW match. This stipulation will be honored about as much as most WWF stipulations, with Koto Fuyuki versus Masato Tanaka. They are now building around a feud with Fuyuki, the booker, and President Shoichi Arai. On September 24th at Korakuen Hall, Fuyuki said that he had finished booking the arena show and his group tied Arai up in the ring. Fuyuki took off his pants and urinated in the ring on Arai. I'm glad to see Fuyuki is so innovative that he's created a concept the Americans are sure to steal. I know, they did it first in Incredibly Strange Wrestling. The ring smelled of dirty urine the rest of the show. Now that must have been fun to them. Watch the rest of the matches. They had a 1 vs 3 match with Tanaka facing Fuyuki, Kentaro Kanemura and Jado, and if Tanaka lost, he'd have to leave FMW. But Arai came back and saved Tanaka and sprayed something in Fuyuki's face, and Tanaka pinned Kanemura to win the match. Porno actor Chocoball Mirai debuted as a mystery partner for Geto and Koji Nakagawa and Fake Hayabusa in the main event on the show, losing to Yoshinori Sasaki and Flying Kid Ichihara and Tetsuhiro Kuroda and H. On September 23rd in Kanazawa, Hisakatsu Oya and Kuroda and Tanaka won the World Entertainment Wrestling 6-man titles from Geto and Nakagawa and Fuyuki when Tanaka pinned Fuyuki. Alexander Karelin, the famed Russian experiment, who drew the huge house in February for his pro wrestling debut against Akira Maeda, captured his all-time record 12th consecutive world championship over the weekend at the World Greco-Roman Championships. Several pro wrestling groups have expressed interest in Karelin, who has said he won't do anything of the sort until after the 2000 Olympics, where he goes for a record 4th gold medal. Kazunari Murakami, who competed in the US with the old Extreme Fighting Championships promotion and later with UFO, has been working with Battlers of late. Also, Taka Michinoku vs Minoru Tanaka was added to the combined Michinoku/Battlers show on October 17th at Yokohama Bunka Gym. Naoki Sano, whose career went from doing lucha libre in Mexico, to being a top junior heavyweight star in New Japan, to doing real shoot fights and getting hammered, is back in pro wrestling with Battlerts as a regular as independent world junior champ for that group. It was originally an FMW belt, but that company dropped the belt. And September 26th in Shiroishi v Tanaka, who he won it from, in a rematch. JWP brought in Takako Inoue for its September 23rd Korakuen Hall show in a tag match teaming with Dynamite Kansai against Renyuyu and Misai Genki. Inoue turned on her partner and also attacked Devil Masami. Azumi Hyuga retained the JWP title in the main event, beating Carlos Amano. Neo Ladies is building a show on October 22nd in Hakata, headlined by Kyoko Inoue defending her WWWA title against Yumiko Hata and Momoe Nakanishi defending her WWWA Super Lightweight title against Chaparita Asari in a pair of AJW vs Neo Ladies matches. The current plan is for the winner of the Inoue Hata match to defend the title against Manami Toyota at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym 2 on December 8th. Urgent announced a big year-end show on December 11th at Yokohama Bunka Gym. Here and there. The Wrestling at the Chase television special will air on KPLR TV in St. Louis on November 6th at 7 p.m. and be repeated later in the month. The show will feature old clips from the St. Louis television show, which did monster ratings in its heyday, promoted by Sam Mushnick, which started on the station in the 50s and continued into the 80s. As a historical note, the final actual taping at the Chase Hotel in 1984 was a WWF show promoted by Vince McMahon after the WWF had bought the time slot away from the NWA promotion, at that point run by Bob Geigel, Vern Gagne, Pat O'Connor and Harley Race. Among those expected to be interviewed for the show are Luthez, Race, Bob Costas, who grew up watching the show, Joe Garagiola, the first announcer, Larry Matuzik, the announcer during the 70s and early 80s who was Mushnick's right-hand man with the promotion during its peak period, and most likely Dory Funk, Terry Funk, Ric Flair and others who worked on the shows as well. Speaking of Race, now 56, he needs both neck and back fusion due to the pounding his body took from more than 3 decades of being one of the best bump takers in the business. Race, who is an admirer of Chris Benoit, said during his interview that he wished he could talk with Benoit, because he loves how Benoit does the diving headbutt, a move Race may have been the first to do, but said 15 years from now, the move will destroy his neck. Jesse Ventura now wants to sue the Moonlight Ranch, the brothel which created a Jesse Ventura room since Ventura apparently used to frequent the place during his Navy SEAL days, and is considering writing a second book. You know when things are really out of control when you find out that the Republican Party in Pennsylvania has expressed interest in Bruno Sammartino running for either mayor of Pittsburgh or for governor. Stampede Wrestling reopened with the first of planned weekly Friday night shows in Calgary and Saturday night shows in Edmonton, drawing about 200 and 350 respectively, which is not a positive showing. In Calgary on September 24th, Carl LeDuc apparently broke his leg wrestling Dick Butkus Jr., no relation to the real one. Canadian League football star Marvin Pope is the headline babyface. Among the names they have underneath are a Mikey Lewinsky and Ralph Silverstein, the real name of a legendary amateur, later pro named Ruffy Silverstein. The small Edmonton crowd was said to have been very responsive. WWC in Puerto Rico is billing their television show as the highest-rated wrestling television show in the world. For example, on September 11th from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. the show drew a 13.2 rating and 42.6 share, and on September 12th from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. it drew a 15.0 rating and 44.3 share, and September 19th did a 12.6 rating. The WWF show, translated into Spanish, on September 11th from 6 to 7 p.m. drew an 11.1 rating and 23.3 share, so WWF in a stronger time slot didn't do the ratings the local show did. The AWA in Puerto Rico, which included several Victor Quiñones wrestlers along with Duke Dries and Ahmed Johnson, has folded. WWC is looking for new American wrestlers with at least 2 years experience. Wrestlers should send tapes and a resume to Capital Sports, P.O. Box 8900, San Juan, Puerto Rico 00910, or email at wasinfo@wwcpr.com. Some more notes on Jody Fleisch. He's 19, lives in London, began training in 1997 under Andre Baker and later trained under Dino Scarlo, but he taught himself his flying moves. He was discovered by Michinoku Pro when Ref Ted Tanabe saw him running up the walls when he accompanied Tiger Mask and Grand Naniwa to a show in London this past April. Power Pro House show business has been really bad. The company basically makes it because WWF pays for much of the talent and because the TV station pays a weekly $1,500 fee for the show. For those same reasons, rumors that the company is close to closing appear untrue, but they've been circulated everywhere. Jim Cornette had set up a meeting on October 2nd in Nashville with Bill Behrens, Hales, himself, Kerry Taylor, who will be working the Music City card, and Burt Prentice, where they'd work together in giving the WWF trainees in the Louisville and Memphis areas more work and trade some talent to give each other fresh faces. However, Hales was so upset at the internet stories that his company was closing down and thought Behrens and Prentice were in some form responsible, and won't be attending the meeting. Vic Grimes won the Power Pro title from Steve Bradley on September 18 in Memphis, and they had a TV rematch go to a draw. Brian Christopher turned on Cornette as referee in the Cornette vs. Hales match on September 18, and then Hales gave him a TV set as a present and apologized for not keeping in touch with him while he recovered from surgery. Christopher then destroyed the TV set, turning back heel. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a story about John Zandig's Combat Zone Wrestling. The same promotion featured last month on ABC's Nightline. The story talked about the stunts, using thumbtacks and flaming tables, but didn't break any new ground. Lord Littlebrook, daughter Lori Brooks, Karate Kid and veteran midget wrestler Cowboy Lang have now taped 3 different episodes of The Jerry Springer Show. Rick Baseman's Ultimate Pro Wrestling has shows October 1st in Santa Ana, California at the Galaxy Concert Theater and October 15th at the Coach House in San Juan Capistrano, California, and if you mention The Observer, you get $1 off ticket prices. At the last show in Santa Ana, among those in attendance were Chris Kanyon, Boss Rutan, Oleg Toktarov, Ken Norton Sr. and Lou Ferrigno. MMA, the TV pilot for the Full Contact Fighter television show on September 20th on TSN in Canada was a huge success. The first show was built around Ken Shamrock's potential return and hyping the Frank Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz match, and drew 265,000 viewers, which would be about a 3.9 rating. With the exception of Raw and Hockey Night and occasional huge sporting events, that beats just about everything on the station. TSN is now looking to air MMA specials as often as possible, wanting it weekly or bi-weekly, but the feeling is due to the lack of new material and major league shows in North America, it'll probably wind up monthly. As a comparison, the highest-rated segments of Off the Record were the ones with Vince McMahon and Bret Hart after the 1997 Survivor Series and a later one with Steve Austin, which drew in the 250,000 viewer range. The final Pancrase pay-per-view show of the year will be December 18th from Yokohama Bunka Gym. Announced as appearing are Semi Schultz, Evan Tanner, Jason DeLucia, Leon Dake and John LeVay. It probably will be the first Pancrase pay-per-view show not headlined by a title match, since the title will be up on November 28 in Osaka with Yuki Kondo defending against Schultz at the Nami High Dome. For the October 3 K1 Grand Prix tournament first round at the Osaka Dome, Nob Hayashi suffered rib injuries in training in Holland and will be replaced by Hayumi Amada for a first-round destruction at the hands of Andy Hug. The entire first round seems to be to give the Stars easy wins so they come out healthy for the Tokyo Dome Final 8 finals. Takada protege Daijiro Matsui will be going to Brazil in February 2000 to face Wanderlei Silva for the IVC middleweight title. If you recall, Valide Ismail, who choked out Royce Gracie in a submissions-only match last year in Rio de Janeiro, has since been marketing himself in the martial arts magazines as some sort of a Gracie killer. At the 1999 BJJ World Championships, Ryan Gracie, who would be a first cousin, got into an actual fight with Ismail over his marketing and blows were traded before things were separated. ECW was another of those good news/bad news weeks. The TV rating being back up to its original levels was the good news. The bad news is that the Tour of Michigan drew poorly, with about 550 fans on September 23 in Grand Rapids, 1,600 for a TV taping on September 24 in Plymouth, Michigan, 600 on September 25 in Lansing, and 856 on September 26 in Flint, Michigan. Due to the poor house show business, Paul Heyman reassigned promoter Greg Bagarozzi, and the house shows will now be promoted by a 4-man team consisting of Lou D'Angeli, Sign Guy Dudley, Ken Reinhurst, Jack Victory, Jim Molyneux, ref, and former promoter Dan Cole. Reports are the shows themselves were some of the best house shows of the year as the work rate is way up. In his first weekend as champion, Mike Awesome's weaknesses became apparent. He had 2 good matches with Rhino, who is going to be a star at some point, but didn't have good matches with either David Cash or Johnny Smith, who also didn't get over. He was said to have gotten an exceptional crowd reaction the first night, a good one the second night, and not a good one the final 2 nights. In the radio ads for Lansing, they were still pushing Taz, Rob Van Dam and Sabu as appearing, none of which were there. The ads also talked about Taz as ECW champ and Balls and Spike as tag champs. Chris Condito and Tammy Sitch returned at the TNN tapings, which were said to be a good show except for the main event. The crowd in Plymouth, Michigan was disappointing, Since they were only 30 minutes from a building, they drew more than 3,000 fans, and the last time they were in and drew only about 1,600 this time. Candido was said to have the same as usual, but reports on Sitch weren't good. While she worked very hard at ringside, she looked so different that she no longer has much presence, which is what she had an abundance of and what got her over from her first day in the wrestling business, and didn't get over at all. Candido and Sitch returned during the tape show open, leading to a confrontation with Lance Storm and Dawn Marie and a match later, which Storm won with Axel Rotten as ref. Just Incredible interfered, leading to Storm's win. Awesome pinned Rhino at the tapings using the same powerbomb through a table finish. Jerry Lynn pinned Super Crazy with his cradle piledriver in what was said to have been a very good match. Yoshihiro Tajiri pinned Tommy Dreamer when Raven came out, but this time he DDT'd Dreamer. This was said to be a really good brawl. Rob Van Dam pinned Rod Price in Van Dam's only match of the weekend, since he's still only working major shows due to his wife's broken leg. The main event was a big disappointment, which was said to be so bad it can't be aired, with Sabu vs Taz, with Sabu getting his win. Taz came out with a look of doing a job written all over his face. Sabu tried his springboard off the chair, off the ropes into the crowd spot, and fell off the ropes 3 straight times, taking a real bad fall on the third one. They never got it back, and weren't helped when a Taz suplex over the top through a table spot on Sabu saw Sabu either miss or barely hit the table, which didn't break, and they tried breaking the table 3 times. Reports were Sabu missed a lot of spots, and it was the worst singles match the two had ever had with each other. Electronic media ran a favorable story on ECW in this week's issue. The story quoted Steve Carl as saying that everything that has been done in pro wrestling over the past 2 years was done first by ECW, and the story said that the time may be right for ECW to take a run at slumping WCW for the number 2 spot. Carl noted ECW has doubled what TNN does among teenage boys and men 18 to 34. That was the same line TNN gave last season, trying to promote Roller Jam as a huge hit because it tripled the number of teenagers that watched TNN. Misleading, since almost no teenagers watch normal TNN programming in the first place. The story says ECW is now averaging about 70,000 buys for its bi-monthly pay-per-view events, which would be just under a 0.19 buy rate. The figure should improve from last week's show because Canadian buy rates for wrestling and MMA are substantially above those of the US, and this was the debut show in the Canadian market. The TNN show this week was mainly pay-per-view replays with one new match, with Joel Gertner doing a good job according to reports we got on most of the announcing, since Joey Styles hadn't fully recovered from laryngitis. The October 22nd Poughkeepsie, New York show will be a TNN taping. Lance Storm was booked on TSN's Off the Record this past week. WCW had a meeting with Hogan this past week where he was told that they were going to start this week promoting Goldberg as the top star of the company. Anyway, the idea is that the television shows will end with Goldberg. Technically, Nitro's final scene was Sid finding his car smashed up, but the show appeared to be built completely around Hogan anyway. A lot of people continue to question the booking where all the faces get laid out for Hogan to make the save, when it would be better to create a younger star by having Hogan and Flair laid out for the new star to save them, whether it be Goldberg or even taking someone else to elevate. Lineup for Halloween Havoc on October 24th in Las Vegas looks to be Sting vs Hogan for the WCW title, Vicious vs Goldberg for the US title, Hart vs Luger, Flair vs Page, Benoit vs Rick Steiner for the TV title, Saturn vs Eddie Guerrero, Douglas, and Malenko vs Mysterio Jr. and Kidman. There are also reports these 2 matches will be combined into a 6-man, and Brad Armstrong vs Berlin. Look at that lineup and find where somebody is being groomed by an older wrestler for future stardom. They need to realize that the ratings and house show decline is not going to stay stagnant if things don't change. It's only going to continue to get worse. The match that looks most interesting is Vicious vs Goldberg. If Goldberg is being pushed as the main man, he should beat Sid clean. At the same time, he shouldn't have the US title as the main man, but he'll hardly come off as the big star on the pay-per-view in one of those muddled everyone runs in DQ finishes in a semi-main event. Of course, if he's supposed to walk over Sid like he should, softball season will probably start the day before. There are stories going throughout the internet about people being fired. At press time, the only people we could confirm are that some power plant developmental deals were dropped, although we don't know the names. That's Scott Vick, Sick Boy, who WWF is interested in and showed potential, James Vandenberg, when was the last time this guy was around? And Public Enemy were dropped. At Nitro, wrestlers who had read their own name on the internet were asking around if they had a job, and nobody seemed to know for sure. But Eric Watts is still with the company, and Silver King was just given a chance to be in his first angle, so that seems to indicate they aren't losing their jobs right now. There will probably be more cuts to come. As far as Savage goes, there are no plans to use him except for personal appearances, and considering his contract, which expires in a few months, it would be logical to think there is a strong chance he won't be renewed, but stranger things have happened. WWF officials have strongly hinted Jim Ross, and outright said Vince Russo, that they aren't interested in him. Nitro from the new Phillips Arena in Atlanta drew 11,919 fans, but that was only 6,244 paying $222,555. The show opened with Sting attacking Hogan's bad knee with a baseball bat in the parking lot. Miller did an interview making it seem like Benoit was just a stepping stone for him to get big matches. Benoit then beat Miller in 6-11 with the crossface in what was actually a good match. Bagwell beat Vampiro in 5:30 with a blockbuster in another good match, although Vampiro was the one who totally made the match. Bagwell got a very good reaction since the show was in Atlanta. The match did feature two of the most screwed up atomic drops in history. They teased the debut of a new mystery character with a weird voice and a promo showing only a mirror. My assumption is this is the beginning of the push for the return of Dustin Runnels in a new weird character that is supposed to be a cross between Goldust and Undertaker. They did a vignette basically where they showed Liz at the funeral of Lex Luger, who rose from the grave and was resurrected, and the spotlight's shone on him in the ring, and he's now the total package. Instead of pushing young guys, they think they are going to turn things around by giving a new character to failed headliners who are already in their 40s. Luger looked in amazing bodybuilding shape for somebody who is coming back from tearing a bicep. While the doctor was examining Hogan, Sting came in the room and hit Hogan in the knee with the bat again. This time Hogan had to be taken to the hospital in an ambulance. Unlike the usual pro wrestling methodology where you spend the whole show saying he's in the hospital and not coming back, the announcers kept saying that they knew he'd be back. My feeling is they felt if they told people Hogan wasn't coming back, that people would turn to Raw. From the ratings, they did anyway when they were told he was coming back. Mysterio Jr. pinned Malenko in 3:38 with La Magistral. Too short, but awesome wrestling. This is the kind of a match that Malenko can really shine. They teased that Sid and Steiner were going to run in and ruin in, but they didn't. Maybe that's an omen that things are changing. Goldberg pinned Morris with the jackhammer in 6:05. Vicious came out during the match and hit Goldberg with a chair and then left. Morris used the moonsault, but Goldberg kicked out and made the big comeback. Goldberg did a decent interview challenging Vicious. They aired another ratings-killing Nitro Girls tryout segment. Berlin pinned Evan Karagias in 3:31 after the unnamed bodyguard punched Karagias. Tons of missed moves. Brad Armstrong ran in, but Berlin and Mr. Toot beat the hell out of him. Goldberg took Sid's car keys. I'm not sure what he needed them for. David Flair tried to call Tori Wilson up. As the show later revealed, Tori stood him up and was with Billy Kidman while the rest of the filthy animals laughed in the background. She told David she was stuck at the airport. Think about this. WWF has spent time successfully promoting women who either can't do interviews to save their lives or who have men's voices, and a few who have both traits, and WCW can't figure out an angle to get Tori Wilson over. Harlem Heat kept the tag titles, beating Barry and Kendall Windham in 9:21 when Stevie Ray hit Barry in the knee with the title belt and T-pinned him. Tony Schiavone said that Booker T was one of the greatest athletes in the sport. He figured he excelled at all sports in high school. Actually, Booker T never did any sports in high school. This match was a mess, but what do you expect when Barry Windham and Stevie Ray are in the same ring? Or even on the same planet? Goldberg made a phone call to what I thought at the time was a towing company, but I guess they ended up smashing the car. Steiner beat Hammer in 4:32 with a top rope bulldog. Charles Robinson played heel ref. Whoever the WCW president is nowadays should revoke that man's license. Oh yeah, there is no president. Or is Sting the president? Maybe Charles Robinson is, because remember that show where J.J. Dillon revealed that if the president is unable to perform his duties, like hanging out in a nut house in a bad skit, that the VP is in charge, and there was never any match where Robinson lost the VP job, was there? Match was boring. Originally this was booked as Sid vs. Hammer, but Sid showed up and said he couldn't wrestle because he was suffering from allergies. That won him a lot of brownie points. Bret Hart did an interview. They brought a makeup person in because they wanted Hart's mouth all messed up on camera to sell the baseball bat shot. Hart refused to get made up, and then downplayed the injury sheepishly, saying he had a few stitches. This was a mess. Gene noted how Sting hit him with the bat. Hart at least remembered it was actually Luger, the problem being that Luger already had a funeral on that show. Hart also didn't sell Hogan's injury. Flair came out and put on a show. Flair also called the guy Lex Luger. Hart called Hogan the Elvis Presley of wrestling, which is kind of a fair comparison, you know, a guy that got incredibly huge, did a bunch of bad movies, and then when he got older became a parody of himself. He said Flair was the best there was, the best there is, and the best there ever will be. Konnan beat Saturn via DQ in 9:30 when Juventud Guerrera Psicosis, Chavo Guerrero Jr., and Silver King, who are apparently forming a new group, Disco Inferno, was asked to be part of this group but opted out. All attacked Konnan. The Filthy Animals made the save. Saturn was fighting everyone when Douglas pulled Saturn out of the ring. They teased dissension within the ranks of the Revolution again. The idea will be to tease dissension, and then when Malenko and Benoit go to Japan next month, have a big blow-up right before they leave. The end result at this point, and of course this will change 4 times in the next 4 weeks, is for them to turn the entire group heel in late October. DDP did an interview. Not bad. Kidman beat Psicosis in the Mask vs. Hair match. This also did the best head-to-head quarter of the show except for Goldberg and the main event, which shows that if you give these guys an angle, they can at least beat out the miserable ratings everyone else is drawing. Kidman won with a shooting star in 9:20 after some fantastic near falls. Psicosis unmasked after. If this was a WWF stipulation match, you realize he'd have lost and still be wearing the mask today. Chavo and Juvie interfered a lot. Fans weren't into it early but got into it big time about halfway through. Easily the best television match from either company this past week. After the match, Psicosis group attacked Kidman but the Animals made the save. Finally Hart and Flair beat Page and Sting and the Dead Man in 7:47 via DQ. Hogan never showed up. Flair got the figure 4 on Sting but Liz gave Luger cheese, now I'm calling him that, the baseball bat. Luger choked out Hart with the bat and Hart bled from the mouth. Luger hit Flair with the bat for the DQ. David Flair ran in for the save. You can guess what happened to him. Page used the diamond cutter on him. Luger racked Flair and Sting put the scorpion on Hart. Hogan limped to the ring and punched everyone out. They tried to use the baseball bat on him, but he got that away and cracked Luger and Page with it but Sting escaped. WCW prelim wrestler Dave Burkhead wrestles on Indies under the name Knuckles Sandwich. With all the injuries that stemmed from that battle royal and other hardcore matches, the concept for the most part was dropped by Bischoff before he lost power. Flair's 26-year-old daughter Megan was married on September 25 in Minneapolis. Gene Okerlund's daughter was married in Minneapolis the same night. The only wrestling person at Flair's wedding was Mark Madden. Ultimo Dragon was at Nitro and was scheduled to meet with WCW the next day. His recovery is not looking good and he was not optimistic about his chances of returning to the ring. Ice Train Harold Hogue was backstage at Nitro looking for work, having dropped 60 pounds, and there is interest in signing him. The live rescheduled Thunder in Norfolk on September 23 was largely a collection of missed spots. Kidman beat Lodi in a match with uncharacteristic bad timing. Sid and Steiner beat up Stevie Ray, which led to Booker T challenging Sid. Brandy Alexander beat Mona. This wasn't as good as their previous TV match. Chavo beat Saturn when Eddie interfered. Sid went from 86-0 on Monday to 99-0, so his match with T was him going for his 100th win. Hasn't WCW realized that nobody takes this streak seriously? Hammer beat Yao Kia and then challenged the Sid vs. Booker T winner. The idea was for Hammer to wrestle Sid on Nitro, but you know. Eddie Guerrero beat Steiner via DQ when Sid interfered. Steiner gave Guerrero almost nothing the entire match. Kidman tried to make the save, but like WCW is about to let a guy of Kidman's limited potential look good against people with so much of a long-term future, that was a sarcastic remark. With the company. Lane kept his cruiserweight title beating Karagi's in another match with a lot of missed spots. Vicious beat Booker T with Robinson as heel ref. ICP is now out this week. Sometimes I think they do this every week just to keep themselves in the news, except there is always backup to their story. Anyway, even though they claimed last week they had signed a new deal with WCW, they hadn't. WCW changed the contract from 75 dates max per year to 150 dates max per year, and with their touring schedule, they couldn't make that kind of a time commitment. Some are saying WCW gave them this contract on purpose as a way to get rid of them after that attempted ECW jump. There may also be another factor. As part of their new deal, they were going to be allowed to promote their music. An ICP music video aired on the September 20th Nitro, and also pass out sample CDs at the house shows. However, before this was agreed to, they went to a house show in Michigan to pass out sample CDs, and the WCW office got numerous complaints from parents since when the kids got home and played the thing, it was all the ICP swearing rap. It really shocked me that WCW would allow them to promote their music as part of the deal in the first place, since the Turner organization is so squeamish about things like that. The list of wrestlers scheduled to appear in the WCW movie, which will have wrestling sequences filmed all day on October 16th and October 30th at the Grand Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, are Goldberg, Savage, Gorgeous George, Sting, Disco, Page, Kimberly, Mysterio Jr., Saturn, Kidman, Scott Steiner, Vicious, Conan, Juventud Guerrera, Bigelow, T, Canyon, Hennig, and other Nitro girls. The only house show of the week was Thunder on September 23rd in Norfolk, drawing 3,782, paying $86,140. Over the past few weeks, merchandise has been averaging $5.46 per head. Medusa returned doing an interview segment on WCW Saturday night. Nitro continues to beat Raw head-to-head in the UK as September 19th saw Nitro with 240,000 viewers to Raw's 210,000, and September 17th saw Nitro with 330,000 to Raw's 300,000. WWF, the condition of Bob Gino Marella, Gorilla Monsoon, worsened over the past week due to complications from diabetes, which has resulted in liver and kidney problems. Marella suffered a mild heart attack on September 19th and has been hospitalized ever since. Raw on September 27th in Greensboro drew 10,369, paying $278,732. The show opened with the refs' strike having been settled. It was Vince McMahon who single-handedly settled things. I think they need to make him commissioner of baseball. Triple H and Chyna did an interview. Bulldog came out and claimed they made a deal that if either of them won the match, they'd give the other the title shot the next day on Raw. Triple H told Bulldog that he lied. I think Triple H aspires to run a wrestling company someday. This segment got surprisingly little heat. Because of the Owen Hart lawsuit, WWF pretty much has to keep Bulldog happy, and I can see the potential down the line of this getting pretty tricky. Bulldog attacked Triple H, but Chyna jumped on him and they left him laying after in Triple H's low blow. The refs broke it up and Vince came out and said Triple H would have to defend against Rock. Ross brought up that Austin would be mad about that. Stephanie and Test were shopping for wedding tuxes. Test seemed a little bored, wanting to shop for lingerie instead. Jarrett came out and said he and Tom Pritchard wanted a match against Deborah and Chyna. Big Show beat Jericho via DQ in 207 when Prince Albert ran in for no reason at all. As Jericho took off, Road Dogg went after him. Road Dogg attacked Hughes while Jericho ran off. Jericho is in danger of losing steam by the manner he's being booked inside the ring, and this segment didn't help. Stevie Richards wanted to be Dude Love and asked Mick Foley. Richards said he wanted to be a chick magnet, but Foley told him the funny part of it was the chicks hated Dude Love. Austin was mad that Vince broke his promise and said he would stomp a mud hole in Vince and walk it dry. Vince pacified Austin by saying he'd get a shot at the next pay-per-view. GTV showed a scene where you were strongly given the impression that Joey Abs and Rodney had just run a train on Terry, and it was Pete Gas' fault. However, they kicked her to the curb and told her to leave. Poor Pete Gas was in his underwear complaining about it. They seem to be grooming him for the Howard Finkel role when he gets a little older, a little fatter, and loses some more hair. Brown beat Blackman via DQ in 145 when he was DQ'd for hitting Brown with the kendo stick. Jimmy Corderas was riffing with his left arm in a sling, which was funny. Those refs do more damage than the wrestlers do. After the match, Blackman cracked Jim Dotson with the kendo stick while Draws beat up Brown. The same siliconed out EMT came out to revive Brown. Henry came out trying to make friends with Brown. Mankind came out for the This Is Your Life segment saying it was Rock's birthday. Rock at the end of the segment revealed his birthday is in May. They started with a 6th grade teacher. They called her Mrs. Griffith and the graphic called her Mrs. Schubert. They said she was a home EC teacher, but the graphic said she was an English teacher. Rock was getting back at her because she never let him make pancakes. They brought out a coach and Rock got mad at him because he made Rock run laps because he gave an opposing player a DDT during a football game. Finally they brought out his high school sweetheart who never let Rock get any poontang pie. His words, not mine. Mankind pulled out a sock with Rock's face on it, called him Mr. Rocco Socko, and brought out jackets for him and Rock to dress as a tag team called the Rock and Sock Connection. Finally they brought out the women clown from the hilarious Vince McMahon hospitalization skit from last year. Foley got mad at Rock for insulting the clown with "it doesn't matter what your name is." They brought out a birthday cake, which didn't end up in anyone's face for some reason. Then Triple H came out with a sledgehammer and brought things to an uninspired ending. The rating for this segment reminded me of the segment where Roddy Piper wrestled his 4 friends in one of the worst segments in the history of Nitro, and it tripled the rating for that quarter hour on Raw anyway. The rating pretty well guarantees more attempts at humor and less attempts at wrestling. The Outlaws challenged anyone to a match. They teased it would be the Hollies, but it turned out to be X-Pac and Kane. There wasn't even any storyline explanation as to why they were back together. The Hollies ran in at 2:23. Kane choke slammed Bob and X did the Bronco Buster on Crash. X-Pac and Outlaws all posed together as a reformed DX after the match. Kane was sort of in the back like a lost puppy. Moolah and Mae Young beat Ivory in an evening gown match. This was hilarious for a few seconds, but they've beaten this joke to death. Ivory KO'd Moolah with a show. Young, who in her day was one very tough woman, there is a famous story about her beating the hell out of male wrestling manager Ken Ramey in the 60s in the Amarillo territory, and by then she was already in her late 40s. Anyway, Johnny May did the world spear followed by the world's slowest ground and pound on Ivory. Young was stripped to her underwear. Lawler joked that their birthday suits needed ironing. She then took a bump over the top rope in slow motion. It took her 3 tries to get over. Moolah finally pulled off Ivory's dress at 2:51, so she lost. Venus picked up Mr. Rocco Sacco from a garbage can and wouldn't you know it, he stuffs. Chyna and Deborah beat Jarrett and Pritchard when Deborah laid out Jarrett and Pritchard cracked the guitar on Chyna's head, but Chyna fell on top for the pin in 1:11. By virtue of pinning Jarrett, Chyna gets a return IC title match on the October 17th pay-per-view from Cleveland. Finally, Rock beat Triple H via DQ in 7:14 with Austin at ringside. This was a very good match. Triple H took a big bump over the top rope and they had a good brawl in the crowd. They wound up in the hockey penalty box and Triple H got his head smashed into the plexiglass. Triple H punched Earl Hebner and hit Rock with a chair. He then challenged Austin, who was doing commentary. Austin ran in and gave him the stunner. Rock then delivered a rock bottom. Hebner and both wrestlers were on the ground selling forever. When Hebner finally recovered to make the pin, Bulldog saved Triple H for the DQ and then attacked Triple H and power slammed him to end the show. SmackDown from September 21st in Dallas had Vince announced that Triple H would have 5 matches on TV against all 5 wrestlers in the six-pack and would have to win 3 of them to keep his spot in the match. First was a choke slam match against Big Show, but Show used the choke slam to win. X-Pac beat Henry via count out and after the match Brown attacked Henry. The Outlaws reunited, with no storyline explanation. I guess they didn't have the cojones to say on television that Mr. Ass just wasn't working out as a heel, and won the tag titles from Rock and Mankind. Triple H beat Kane in an Inferno match when Undertaker beat up X-Pac and bloodied him up, and Kane was distracted, allowing Mideon and Viscera to put his hands into the flames. Taker then said he wouldn't wrestle his casket match against Triple H. Vince told him he had to. He then quit the promotion. This, planned 6 weeks or so, is to allow him to heal his nagging injuries and also to get Paul Bearer off the road and drop some weight. I didn't realize he had a weight problem. I thought he was auditioning for a role as a stunt double for Eddie Murphy in Nutty Professor 2. Mideon and Viscera then beat Triple H in the casket match. Triple H put Mideon in the casket, but Shane explained the match continued until both guys were in. Viscera ended up getting Triple H in, so he was left having to beat both Mankind and Rock to win. Bob Holly beat Snow when Bossman distracted Snow by putting dog food in his face. Bob Holly then beat Crash Holly. Triple H beat Mankind in a boiler room match when Triple H was about a mile away from Mankind, who climbed up on a scaffold. An unknown assailant, maybe it's the same guy who raised the belt during the match where Austin was going for ownership of the company, shoved Mankind off the scaffold about 10 feet through a table and Triple H escaped the room to win. Bulldog asked for and was given the spot in the six-pack match that Undertaker left behind. Jericho beat Shamrock in the first blood match when Hughes attacked Shamrock, who spit up blood doing the internal injuries gimmick. In a bull rope match, called a Brahma Bull match, Triple H beat Rock. First Jarrett KO'd Chyna and put her in the figure 4. Bulldog was the ref and beat up Rock, allowing Triple H to win the match. After the match, Bret Hall and another member of the Dallas Stars got in the ring and sang SmackDown Hotel with Rock. With the election on October 17th, Lawler has been actively campaigning in Memphis. We haven't seen any poll figures other than he's believed to be closing the gap. Lawler has been distributing booklets with a 12-point plan for improving education, saying he'd like the state legislature to do away with the school board and make the mayor's office directly responsible for overseeing the schools. He proposed all students go to school wearing school uniforms, supported merit-based pay increases for teachers and the end of advancing students to the next grade when they haven't reached academic proficiency to advance. He said he'd like to set up 1 hour of tutoring after school for students who fall behind and would bring WWF wrestlers to speak at city schools. Lawler was also indicted on September 23 by a Shelby County grand jury on charges of reckless endangerment stemming from a March 5 incident involving an airport security employee. If you recall, Lawler was at the airport in a loading zone, given a parking ticket and crumbled up the ticket and threw it at the employee, Camille Pegues. This much Lawler also admits to. Pegues claimed Lawler screamed obscenities at her, crumbled up and threw the ticket at her, and then he started his van and drove over his foot. Lawler in the media tried to turn the story into how the timing looks funny just a few weeks before the election, and claimed this happened because he was improving in the polls. He maintained he never ran over Pegues' foot and that she was pursuing the case against him because he's a celebrity. The felony charge brings a maximum 2-year prison term. A convicted felon is not allowed to run for public office in Tennessee, but that doesn't apply to someone under indictment. However, if Lawler should win the election and then get convicted, he could be forced out of office. Rival candidate Pete Sisson said the day after the indictment that any candidate arrested or convicted of a crime should withdraw from the race. Lawler's attorney was attempting to get the indictment rescinded. The Deputy District Attorney General, James Challen, said that Lawler's case proceeded like any other, and that the office would get criticized if they slowed it down or sped it up because of the election. On the Billboard sports video charts, the WWF was in positions 1 through 6 and had 11 of the top 20, with Rock's video ahead of Austin's latest for number 1. 3 new WCW videos, Mayhem, Hogan and Flair, debuted at numbers 7, 9 and 11 respectively. A Piper video is number 12 and Wrestling with Shadows is number 19. The expected IPO date is October 11th, with a proposed initial offering of 10 million shares priced at between $14 and $16. It is expected that the price will be significantly higher by the time it's available to the public. The underwriters make out on that one directly, not McMahon. But if the price goes up, that makes the other 80% of the stock the family is keeping worth a tremendous amount more than it would be going, and so he makes out great on it as well indirectly. It also explains why wrestlers and front office employees are hoping to get a shot at buying stock before it goes public. Taz officially signed on September 22. Christina Lom, Kimona from ECW, signed this past week as well. Time magazine did a Q&A with Chyna, basically attempting to make her look like a fool with questions like how much did it cost for huge fake breasts. Her answer was $6,000, which she compared it with a real estate investment, because someday she'll sell them on the internet for a profit. She admitted to being Triple H's girlfriend and that when they wrestled, he let her win, and they laughed about that one too. They also asked her if it embarrassed her when she found out the correct spelling of Chyna was with an I. She had decent comebacks, but overall it made her come across as a freakazoid. Shows this week saw SmackDown on September 21 in Dallas drew a sellout 13,348, paying $375,621, and a house show September 25 in Augusta, Georgia drew 7,666, paying $195,118. Those 2 days in Raw in Greensboro did $204,649 in merchandise, which works out to $6.52 per head. The house show was headlined by Rock over Jericho. They also worked a fair show on September 23 in Oklahoma City, headlined by Kane over Bradshaw. Apparently the reason Michaels wasn't used at all on the Texas TV shows was because management was upset at him for publicly complaining on the WWF's own internet site that Austin should have done a clean job in a singles match at SummerSlam for Triple H, and the title switch and the way it was done screwed Triple H. Michaels evidently thought he was in WCW, where everyone goes on the site and complains about how things are handled and gives their own opinion about decisions, as if there is actually freedom of expression in this industry. If you're a top star in WCW, you even have freedom of opinion outside the website. If you're a mid-carder and you complain in the wrong forum, you're screwed too. In an equally humorous story on the WWF Bite This Show, Bulldog claimed that until he recently met with McMahon, he never knew that Bret Hart had refused to do the job at Survivor Series. Let's get this straight. Did he miss all 500 showings of Wrestling with Shadows? Did he forget about everything that went on the week leading up to the match that he personally witnessed? Did he forget that he himself was one of the wrestlers who during the week warned Hart not to lay down on the mat for fear of being fast counted? Did he forget about Earl Hebner swearing on his kids' lives about not fast counting Bret, which, I guess, technically he didn't do? Did he forget that he injured his own knee breaking up the post-match fracas involving Hart, Vince, and Shane? Knight Ridder newspapers did a story on Paul White, saying he's now 470 pounds after liposuction. The story said the WWF told him to get liposuction when he signed with them at a weight of 537 pounds. White said he had no problem with getting liposuction because it's a business about bodies and the era of big, fat giants is over. The story claimed the WWF's Raw destroys the ratings of Monday Night Football. Isn't it amazing how that has become fact despite the stats showing otherwise? And the NBA playoffs, it absolutely destroys the early rounds, but can't touch the finals. The story talked about White as being a 7'1" high school senior in Aiken, South Carolina, and his basketball exploits there. That was funny because I remember hearing a story from his JC coach who talked about him getting acromegaly one year and spurting up in his freshman year from 6'8" to 7'0", which I guess must mean as a precursor to the acromegaly, he shrunk from 7'1" as a high schooler to 6'8" in college. Kind of like Hogan's height going from 6'9" in the 80s to being noticeably shorter than 6'6" Rodman in the 90s. The story said that White impresses fans more with his fluid movement, coordination, and endurance than his size. Sure. The reader's pages. Valente Perez. What will 1999 be remembered for in wrestling? To me, despite everything else, it's the year of the big-name deaths. From Giant Baba to Owen Hart to Cavernario Galindo to Diablo Velasco, to Brian Hildebrand to everyone else, it's been a year of transitions. Though this name won't mean anything to people outside Mexico, it's the third of the 20 most influential people ever in Lucha Libre who passed away. Valente Perez, 75, died late September 20th at his retirement home in Miami. Perez was the longtime editor of the #2 wrestling magazine in Mexico, Lucha Libre, back when there were more than 20 weekly magazines and most every newspaper covered Lucha Libre, and it was much bigger than it is today. Being the editor of the #2 magazine made him very influential. Box E Lucha #1 and has been since its debut in 1953 except for a short period in the mid-90s when Super Luchas passed it. But then the cost of color newsprint went up, and the Mexican economy went down and Super Luchas was never the same. Perez tried to cover the hard news of the week, but he also knew the #3 publication was the little square color cartoon magazine that each week drew a fictional story using a real wrestler like El Santo or Blue Demon, having them fight injustice and crime with scantily clad women thrown around liberally, aimed at the lowbrow reader. Perez very astutely realized it was the fantastic story and the elements therein that were hooking the reader. So, in 1963, he started a regular section in his magazine where a completely fictitious wrestler would fight crime and win the woman, all in print, with no drawings. This actually was the same idea the first movie director of a lucha film had in 1951, to make a movie villain out of cloth like an evil wrestler, and called the villain Medico Asesino, before anyone used that name in pro wrestling. But the movie director was wise, because the mask of Medico Asesino was the same mask of El Santo, and soon it was Santo who became the star of the movies. The first wrestler that Perez created out of whole cloth and made a hero in his stories was called Mil Mascaras. The second was Babeface and the third was Tinieblas. The fourth never made it, but the fifth, who debuted in early 1965, was Chicano Power. Amazingly for this business, 4 of his first 5 gimmicks are still wrestling today, 34 years later, all with their original worker under the hood, although Babeface, who debuted in 1968, and Chicano Power only wrestle infrequently. Perez made a huge profit because he trademarked the rights to every name he created and made the wrestlers pay dearly to buy the rights from him, which they all did, and 3 of them became international main eventers. EMLL eventually convinced Perez to let them train wrestlers to play Perez characters in real life, and the rest is history. As with any creative genius, Perez surely had more flops than hits, and some characters were probably left on the editing floor, but he also created as Charo, El Audas, or as TNT and El Rostro. Perez was a huge mark for bodybuilding and weightlifting, and actually Babeface, Mascaras and Chicano Power who bodybuilders before becoming wrestlers. Tinieblas was an actor and never any kind of an athlete. He was hired not to wrestle at first, but to play Tinieblas in the movies. Wrestling was always second to him to the movies. Perez ran a bodybuilding magazine that never made money, but he was so rich he continued it as a labor of love. Steve Dr. Lucha Sims. Chula Vista, California. Indie wrestling. During the past couple of months I attended 3 small shows that renewed my faith somewhat in the strange world that is pro wrestling. An independent show at a campground in Shortlaville, Pennsylvania drew only 150 or so fans for a last-minute card put together by Dino Sana that headlined King Kong Bundy vs. Jack Hammer and featured Missy Hyatt, Gilbert, and an appearance by Bruno Sammartino as a television commentator. While the crowd was sparse, all those advertised appeared and were extraordinarily accessible to the fans. Sammartino took all kinds of time before, during, and after the show to pose for photos and sign autographs and chat with fans, many of whom were there specifically to see him. Gilbert posed with kids after allowing them to wear his title belt until each request was satisfied. My 6-year-old son was thrilled and wanted to watch tapes of Bruno for the next week. Members of the family were entertained just hearing him pronounce his name, as my wife is a full-blooded Italian. An ECW show at the Kingston Armory near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania was attended by a crowd of 300 to 400. But the wrestlers all worked and gave everyone their money's worth, despite the fact they could have easily mailed in their performance. Needless to say, I didn't take my 6-year-old to the ECW show, but it was certainly an entertaining evening and well worth a 1-hour drive. The third show I attended was an independent show in Palo Alto, a small community located on a hill overlooking Pottsville, Pennsylvania. When I pulled into the parking lot, the Insane Clown Posse bus was already there, and even though they weren't advertised, they were socializing with fans in the back and promising to work later in the show. Sure enough, they did work, which added to a fine show highlighted by what I'd rate as a 4 stars match between Reckless Youth and Mike Quackenbush. The small shows with reasonable ticket prices, around $10, and accessible wrestlers who recognize the fans are where it's at, and a welcome change from the big arena shows with distant stars going through the motions if they show up at all. Back to reality, the Riveridge nightclub at the edge of Reading, Pennsylvania has Nicole Bass vs. Ryan Shamrock in a Babes of Wrestling extravaganza this week, and you can see that match for only $25, including beer. My 6-year-old and I will be skipping that one entirely. One can only imagine that atmosphere. Bill Gilger. Shoemakersville, Pennsylvania. WWF vs. WCW. I'm getting a little sick of the continued remarks to the effect that the WWF talent roster is thin, and that WCW has the superior talent. I think that may have been valid 12 to 18 months ago, but that is not the case today. The WWF has Austin Rock, Triple H, Jarrett, Big Show, D'Lo Brown, Shamrock, Hardy Boys, X-Pac, Road Dogg, Edge, and a ton of others who are clearly being given the opportunity from week to week to move into the main events. In WCW, you may have a few bigger names, but most of them had their best days with Titan. As a business owner, I can also appreciate McMahon has done more with less. That's smart business. Just look at the return on investment for each company. I think it's not a case of actually having less talent, just having less name talent. And with the WWF's marketing, the lesser talent will most likely be the bigger stars in 2 years. At that point, where will WCW's big names be? The talent is there, but it'll be too late to elevate Bagwell and Benoit and all the rest by then. Meanwhile, anybody want to bet against Jericho being the man in WWF by then? Christopher Cassidy. Tewksbury, Massachusetts. Anyone who has watched both Monday night shows can tell one is in a tailspin and the other is enjoying record ratings and popularity. If I was a parent of a 10 to 15-year-old, the WWF would be the last thing I'd want them to watch. Some people say you can't argue with success and you can't deny the current popularity of the WWF. I've noticed that have toned down some of the sexual aspects of the show in favor of more violence. Why any wrestler would do a blade job today, no matter how much money they are making, is beyond me. The WCW doesn't need to copy Vince McMahon's formula. They need to come up with one of their own. What is wrong with athletic competition? Lose the old hacks that are hanging around gobbling up those huge paychecks and get back to wrestling. Sports entertainment will die a horrible death someday, and it will take this industry a long time to rebound from it. WCW needs to retool with new names, new faces, and a new goal in mind. It might take them 6 months or more of getting whipped in the ratings, but that's going to happen anyway, to re-educate their audience, but I feel that is what they must do to compete. If they become a poor man's copy of the WWF, they will fail, even with the money behind them. Ron Martinez. Seffner, Florida. After watching WCW for the past year, I've decided to announce my candidacy for the vice president of WCW job. Sure, I may not have any qualifications at the moment, but by 2002, I can establish myself as a mediocre television announcer. I haven't hosted a game show yet, but with a plethora of game shows, I could host Tic-Tac-Toe or That Game Show with a Whammy. As WCW vice president, I can continue the tradition that's been in existence in the NWA and WCW for the past 10 to 12 years. My commitment to incompetence will take WCW to a whole new level. If you think Bischoff, Nash, Hogan and Rhodes are geniuses, wait until you get a look at WCW behind Fred Esquire, I'm dropping my Latino surname, and the weekly revolving door of teen idols as guest hosts. The first week Gary Coleman. Next week Arnold Horsch. Then Urkel. Don't forget September is the month-long 8 is enough guest hosts. The first order of business will be to fire Rhodes, Kevin Sullivan and every other booker. They're too creative and come up with too many fresh ideas. Plus, they keep wanting to push the young guys like Sting, Nash and Luger as headliners. I'll hire the one man who can do the job booking WCW, Not Paul E. Not Vic Venom. Not Terry Taylor. My choice is Cowboy Bill Watts. He's experienced and his old school philosophies will invigorate the business. The first change will be to eliminate all high flying. Climb the top rope. Automatic disqualification. Jump off the top rope. 30 days suspension. Heaven forbid anyone tries a dive to the outside. We'll start pushing new stars like Eric Watts, Ed Leslie, the Wyndham brothers, Horace Hogan, and Barry Darsow. We will reintroduce classic gimmicks since this is a new audience. Oz the Ding Dongs, Thunderfeet, Big Josh, El Gran Pistolero the Gobbledygooker, the Rap Master PN News, Shockmaster. We'll bring in Russians from North Carolina, the No Limit Soldiers and Mascara Sagrada 37. Oh yeah, and the Yeti. Ron Race is still under contract. I'll sign ex-WWF stars like Yokozuna, Draws, Prince Albert Kurgan, and Gilbert. Starrcade 2005 will be built up to the first main event of two African Americans. It'll be six-time world champion Stevie Ray against my karate trainer, Ernest Miller. Starrcade 2010 will be headlined by the long-awaited rematch of Hulk Hogan vs. Randy Savage. No DQ. Falls count anywhere. Barbed wire. Thumbtacks. Glass spider net lucha libre explosion. First man to stand up wins rules. The semi-main will be Dennis Rodman and Miller vs. Horace Hogan and Vincent. I'll bring in the best in new musical acts every week to Nitro. Loverboy. Kajagoogoo. ELO. BTO. The Sugar Hill Gang. To keep my Latino fans happy, I'll book Julio Iglesias and Juan Gabriel. I'll hire my best friends from childhood to work everywhere from ring announcer to referee. I'll be just like Shane McMahon, except my friends aren't as cool, tough, or as handsome as his. When doing media interviews, I'll claim to have invented every marketing concept in pro wrestling. All the New Japan ideas I steal, I'll just claim to have had a vision. When talking about myself, I'll always refer to myself in the third person and try and get myself over more than WCW or any wrestler. At the end of every interview, I'll try and make sure to get the point across that wrestling never really existed before I showed up. I'll end all interviews by saying, Fred made wrestling. Alfredo Esparza. Pomona, California. I think it's time WCW makes a drastic move and hands the book to some non-revengeful committee members. Benoit's loss to Sid along with Steiner's no-selling in the TV title was appalling. They need to elevate Benoit and more youth as you've been writing all along. I can't wait to see Dustin start in the main events. I've been really quiet since Owen Hart's tragic death. I grew up watching Owen from the start as a rookie in Calgary. Maybe you feel stronger about someone that is the same age as you are and you mature at the same time you see that person grow on television. All the letters of people writing that the show should have stopped or should have gone on is never going to change the fact that Owen is gone. I think most of us have our own opinion of who was right and wrong and what we think of McMahon. I would have thought that Chris Jericho would have been pushed differently upon his arrival. His first altercation with Road Dogg, where Road Dogg got so much of the upper hand, didn't come across as impressive. I wish him the best as he's a great performer and keeps my blood in. He was a highly intelligent guest on TSN's Off the Record as well. TSN's Full Contact Fighter television show was interesting. They showed clips of PPVs and included footage that had kept mixed martial arts off television in Canada, so I was surprised. It will be interesting to see where the show leads. It's a start in the right direction. They even admitted on the show that Nevada will never sanction it as long as boxing is around. Grant Swarich. Peterborough, Ontario. ECW. Why does ECW keep saying this is Tommy Dreamer's first championship gold? What happened to his tag team title reign with Johnny Gunn in 1993? If ECW continues to announce their pay-per-view main event only 2 weeks before the actual date, they will continue to have poor buy rates. They had 2 full months to promote their show, a luxury WWF and WCW don't have. Because Taz match isn't even announced until 2 weeks before the show, it comes across like a WWF European title defense on a run-of-the-mill show. Chris Chetty has a gimmick that could take off into a potential draw against Rob Van Dam. But the longer Chetty is in opening tag matches nobody cares about, the harder it's going to be to break him out of the pack. ECW already killed off the mystique of Uganda vs. Taz by jobbing him to Van Dam. What are the chances of Christian going to ECW to become a headliner? Kevin Convery Jr. Kenmore, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer. I don't see the fit with Christian in ECW. The guys WWF is looking to send to ECW are guys who need more ring time to get ready for the big time. Christian hardly falls into that category. It doesn't benefit ECW to be perceived by the public as the WWF's farm system anyway. Frank Shamrock. The US wrestling scene is pretty pathetic. I'm so far behind in watching Monday tapes because I'm not really motivated to watch them. The only interesting thing these days are interviews by Rock and Jericho. The last time I renewed I told you that I'd probably concentrate on Japan and begin to watch MMA and worked shoot matches. Well, now I'm taking it a step farther. About a month ago I joined up at Frank Shamrock's Universal Submission Academy. Let me tell you that being a former high school wrestler hasn't helped me much. I feel like Dan Severn out there, shooting for the takedown and walking into a guillotine choke. I can say one thing for sure. For all the people who say that Tito Ortiz has the definite wrestling skill advantage, I say no way. I've wrestled against state and national quality wrestlers and Frank Shamrock can definitely hold his own when it comes to wrestling skill. It will be a grappling clinic and Tito Ortiz, much like myself, will just be a student learning. Bilatani, Cupertino, California. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine.